Hey everybody, this is Sleepy Crime, and today I'm gonna help you. I know you want to fall asleep to this video, so before you do, put a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you from and what time are you watching? Make yourself comfortable and relax. Tara Grinstead was born on November 14th, 1974, in Hawkinsville, Georgia, a small city with deep southern roots and close-knit communities. Raised in a modest household, Tara developed an early interest in education and performance. As a child, she was recognized for her charm and intelligence, traits that would later define much of her adult life. She pursued higher education with dedication, eventually earning a degree in history and entering the teaching profession. Tara began teaching at Irwin County High School in Ocilla, Georgia, where she quickly became known as a passionate and well-liked educator. Students respected her, colleagues admired her commitment, and the community embraced her presence. In addition to her academic pursuits, Tara was deeply involved in Georgia's beauty pageant circuit. She competed in multiple local and state-level competitions, eventually earning the title of Miss Tifton. Her poise, charisma, and polished public presence made her a standout in pageantry. She later served as a mentor to aspiring contestants, offering guidance on presentation and confidence. Outside the classroom and pageants, Tara was a private person with a wide social circle. She was seen as someone who maintained strong familial bonds and had an active role in the social life of Ocilla. By 2005, she had taught at Irwin County High for about 8 years, building relationships with hundreds of students and their families. At 30 years old, Tara was at a point in life where she was balancing professional fulfillment with personal aspirations. There were no immediate signs of turmoil or distress in her life, at least from the outside. She lived alone in a small home on West Park Street in Ocilla, and was known for her organized, responsible lifestyle. The equilibrium of Tara's life was disrupted in October 2005, setting in motion a sequence of events that would confound investigators and captivate the nation. What began as a normal weekend for a respected teacher and a former beauty queen would soon become one of Georgia's most perplexing criminal investigations. The weekend of October 22, 2005, began like many others for Tara Grinstead. That Saturday, she attended the annual Sweet Potato Festival in the nearby town of Fitzgerald. She had been helping contestants prepare for the local beauty pageant and was involved with organizing aspects of the event. According to witnesses, Tara was seen that evening at a barbecue hosted by a colleague. She appeared in good spirits, socialized with friends, and left the gathering around 11 p.m. That would be the last confirmed sighting of her. Tara was scheduled to return to work at Irwin County High School on Monday, October the 24th. When she failed to appear, concern quickly spread. It was out of character for her to miss work without notifying anyone. Her absence was first noticed by school staff, who made repeated attempts to contact her. When those efforts were unsuccessful, friends and family grew alarmed. A local officer visited her residence on West Park Street that same day. The front door was locked. Tara's car, a black Mitsubishi 3000 GT, was parked in the driveway. There were no immediate signs of forced entry or struggle. Upon entering the home, investigators found her cell phone charging, her purse present, and a broken lamp on the floor. The house appeared mostly undisturbed, but some details raised concerns. A latex glove was discovered outside the residence, which would later become a focal point in the investigation. Her neighbors had not reported anything unusual from the night she vanished. Dogs were brought in to assist in the search, and volunteers began combing the surrounding areas. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation joined the effort quickly, recognizing the potential gravity of the situation. From the beginning, the disappearance appeared suspicious. Tara's car was in working order. Her personal belongings remained in the house. There were no signs that she had packed to go anywhere, and no communications indicated travel plans. The broken lamp and the glove hinted at possible foul play, though no immediate conclusions could be drawn. The following days saw a flurry of search efforts. Posters bearing her image were distributed across Ocilla and neighboring towns. Law enforcement conducted interviews with family, friends, students, and acquaintances. The media began reporting on the case, drawing regional attention to the quiet town of Ocilla. Despite a swift and thorough initial response, no clear leads emerged in the days after Tara Grinstead vanished. The case quickly became a mystery, raising questions that would go unanswered for over a decade. In the days and weeks following Tara Grinstead's disappearance, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation launched an intensive effort to determine what had happened. Investigators focused first on her house and the immediate surroundings, looking for any physical evidence that could explain her sudden vanishing. Inside the house, items were found in positions that suggested something unexpected had occurred. The broken lamp on the bedroom floor became a key observation. Though nothing else was overtly out of place, this disruption hinted at a possible struggle. The presence of a single latex glove outside near the front steps raised more questions. It was an odd detail that did not align with Tara's known habits, and its discovery so close to her door was troubling. Law enforcement collected numerous items for forensic testing, including the glove, household items, and Tara's vehicle. The car showed no signs of forced entry or tampering. Investigators also secured Tara's personal computer and cell phone records, looking for clues about her last known contacts or plans. Her last cell phone activity was recorded the night she returned from the barbecue. As the investigation expanded, authorities interviewed dozens of people in Tara's life. This included co-workers, friends, former students, and men she had previously dated. Each person was scrutinized for possible motives or information that might explain her disappearance. Several individuals were briefly considered persons of interest, but no arrests were made. Volunteers from the community joined search parties. They combed through wooded areas, farmland, and abandoned buildings across Irwin County and beyond. Cadaver dogs were deployed, and local rivers and ponds were searched. Despite the widespread effort, no trace of Tara was found. Speculation within the community grew. Some believed she had been abducted by someone she knew. Others suggested she might have left voluntarily, though that theory held little weight given the circumstances. Investigators pursued leads ranging from former students to associates in her personal life, yet every path eventually reached a dead end. Billboards and media appearances spread awareness across the region. Tara's case gained coverage on national television programs, which brought in tips from across the country. However, these tips rarely yielded actionable evidence. The absence of clear forensic evidence, witnesses, or a confession left the investigation mired in uncertainty. Despite relentless efforts, the case grew cold as time passed. The sense of urgency remained, but so did the frustration. A young woman had vanished without a trace, and despite the full attention of local and state authorities, there was still no answer. By the end of 2005, it was clear that solving Tara Grinstead's disappearance would not come easily. The community's hope began to give way to fear that the person responsible might never be found. As the weeks turned into months and then years, the disappearance of Tara Grinstead became one of Georgia's most baffling cold cases. By early 2006, with no major developments or new leads, investigators began to scale back active searches, though the case was never closed. The Irwin County community, once the center of a high-profile investigation, settled into a prolonged state of uncertainty. Posters faded, search efforts dwindled, and the national media turned its focus elsewhere. But for Tara's family, colleagues, and students, the mystery remained a constant presence. Her absence was deeply felt at Irwin County High School, where memorials and events were held to honor her and keep the case in the public eye. In the following years, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation continued to follow up on occasional tips and potential leads. Investigators traveled across state lines to interview individuals and follow trails suggested by anonymous sources. Several people were polygraphed, and some were brought in for questioning more than once. But none of the interviews yielded the critical information needed to make an arrest. Technological advancements offered new hopes. DNA evidence collected from the glove found outside Tara's home was submitted to national databases, but no matches were found. Forensic experts reanalyzed materials using updated methods, yet the results remained inconclusive. Throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s, the case received intermittent media attention. Television shows and news specials revisited Tara's story, occasionally sparking renewed public interest and bringing in fresh tips. Still, none of these efforts provided the breakthrough investigators needed. The lack of progress was especially painful for those closest to Tara. Her stepmother and sister continued to advocate for justice, conducting interviews and organizing events to maintain visibility. Every passing anniversary served as a reminder of the lingering questions and unresolved grief. Public theories abounded. Online forums dissected every known detail of the case, and amateur sleuths debated potential scenarios. Despite the speculation, law enforcement consistently stated that the investigation was active and ongoing, though no suspects were ever publicly identified. Over the years, Tara's case became a symbol of unresolved tragedy. It was often cited in discussions about missing persons and the challenges of cold case investigations. The initial urgency of the search had long since faded, but the desire for answers had not. By 2016, over a decade after Tara Grinstead vanished, her case remained one of the most high-profile unsolved disappearances in the state. Behind the scenes, investigators never completely stopped working. Files remained open, evidence preserved, and hopes quietly held that someday, someone would come forward, and that the truth, long buried, would finally emerge. By 2016, Tara Grinstead's case had been cold for more than a decade. Although it had received national media coverage, no arrests had been made, and no major breakthroughs had occurred. Then, a new form of storytelling breathed life into the long-stalled investigation. A podcast. Up and Vanished, launched by Atlanta-based filmmaker Payne Lindsay, debuted in August 2016. The series aimed to explore and expose the details of Tara's disappearance through interviews, analysis of public records, and first-hand investigation. The podcast quickly gained a large following. Listeners were drawn not only to the unresolved mystery, but also to the unfolding process of inquiry. As new episodes were released, the case was introduced to a broader audience, some of whom had never heard of it before. Lindsay's podcast generated renewed public interest and pressure. People began submitting tips, theories, and recollections. The case returned to the headlines, and local authorities acknowledged the heightened attention. According to statements made at the time, the podcast prompted some individuals to re-engage with investigators, bringing forward previously unreported information. The series detailed inconsistencies in early reports, offered alternative timelines, and explored possible suspects. It also re-examined known facts, including the broken lamp, the glove, and the timeline of Tara's last evening. This re-examination led to new scrutiny and, indirectly, to breakthroughs behind the scenes. As more people listened, whispers of developments in the case began to circulate. Authorities remained publicly cautious, but it became clear that the investigation had gained momentum. The increased visibility motivated those with knowledge of the case to come forward. Some individuals had remained silent for years due to fear or uncertainty, but the climate of renewed attention seemed to shift those dynamics. In early 2017, after years of limited movement, authorities took significant action. The podcast had not solved the case itself, but it had reawakened interest, stirred memories, and reactivated leads that had long gone cold. The developments that followed would soon reshape everything previously known about the disappearance of Tara Grinstead. Up and Vanished demonstrated the power of media in modern investigations. The case, once stagnant, was now front and center in the public consciousness. For the first time in over a decade, real answers seemed possible. On February 23, 2017, more than 11 years after Tara Grinstead vanished, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation announced a major development. Ryan Alexander Duke, a former student at Irwin County High School, was arrested and charged with her murder. The news came as a shock. Duke's name had not previously been mentioned publicly in connection with the case, and his sudden appearance as a suspect stunned both the community and investigators who had worked the case for years. Duke was 33 years old at the time of his arrest. He had graduated from the same school where Tara taught, but there had been no widely known personal connection between them. According to the charges, Duke had entered Tara's home intending to steal money, and during the attempted burglary, he killed her. The arrest affidavit stated that he had removed her body and concealed it. The following month, another man was arrested, Bo Dukes, a friend and former classmate of Duke. Dukes was charged with helping dispose of Tara's remains and concealing her death. According to law enforcement, Dukes confessed during an interview that he had helped burn Tara's body in a pecan orchard in nearby Ben Hill County shortly after the murder. This location had never been searched in the years following her disappearance. Investigators said that Duke had confessed to the crime during an interview conducted just days before his arrest. His statements, paired with Dukes' account, formed the basis for the charges. According to the information made public, Tara's body had been destroyed by fire over the course of several days, making recovery of physical remains extremely difficult. The arrests were the result of renewed investigative efforts that included interviews with people who had remained silent for years. The increased pressure following the podcast had reportedly prompted someone close to the suspects to come forward, ultimately leading to Duke's confession and Duke's cooperation. In a small town like Ocilla, the revelation was deeply unsettling. Both men had roots in the community. Many residents were left grappling with the possibility that someone they knew, someone who had walked the same streets, attended the same schools, had been responsible for Tara's disappearance all along. Despite the arrests, many questions remained unanswered. Neither suspect had initially been on law enforcement's radar, and there were lingering doubts about the full extent of each man's involvement. The discovery raised new leads and opened fresh avenues for investigation, but it also brought the painful truth of Tara's fate closer to reality. For Tara's family and friends, the arrests marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by the search for a missing person, but by the pursuit of justice. Following the 2017 arrests, the legal process in the Tara Grinstead case began to unfold. Ryan Alexander Duke, charged with murder, burglary, aggravated assault, and concealing a death, entered a plea of not guilty. Bo Dukes, accused of concealing a death, hindering apprehension, and tampering with evidence, also denied the most serious elements of the state's narrative. The cases moved slowly. Defense teams filed multiple motions, and the prosecution prepared for a trial that had already attracted significant public and media interest. Pre-trial hearings examined the admissibility of confessions and the reliability of the statements made by both men. Duke's defense team argued that his confession had been coerced and that he was under the influence of drugs at the time it was made. In 2019, Bo Dukes was tried first in connection to his role in concealing Tara's death. During the proceedings, he admitted to helping dispose of her body in a pecan orchard and confirmed that Duke had confessed the murder to him shortly after it happened. The jury found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Ryan Duke's trial faced numerous delays, largely due to legal disputes and logistical issues, including funding for his defense. It wasn't until May 2022 that the trial finally commenced in Irwin County. The prosecution presented evidence including Duke's 2017 confession and the testimony of Bo Dukes. They contended that Duke had broken into Tara's house, killed her, and enlisted his friend to help hide the crime. The defense, however, countered with a different version. Duke took the stand and retracted his confession, claiming that it was Bo Dukes, not he, who had killed Tara. He testified that he had falsely confessed under pressure and out of fear. This reversal introduced further complexity to an already convoluted case. Jurors deliberated on the conflicting testimonies, the timeline of events, and the absence of physical remains. In a surprising outcome, Ryan Duke was acquitted of the most serious charges, including murder, but was found guilty of concealing a death. He received a 10-year sentence with credit for time served. The verdict left many in the community, and Tara's family feeling unresolved. While the trial offered some measure of closure, it also highlighted gaps in the narrative. The full circumstances of Tara's death remained partially obscured, shaped by shifting stories and a lack of definitive forensic evidence. The trials represented a culmination of years of investigative effort, public interest, and legal maneuvering. But for those who had known Tara, the proceedings did not provide all the answers they had hoped for. What emerged instead was a portrait of a case shaped by silence, fear, and a long delay in justice. Following the trials of Bo Dukes and Ryan Duke, the legal process continued to evolve. Both convictions triggered further legal maneuvers as defense teams filed appeals and motions challenging aspects of the proceedings. In particular, attention turned to the handling of evidence, the reliability of confessions, and procedural issues that had arisen during the trials. Ryan Duke's legal team appealed his conviction for concealing a death, arguing that his initial confession had been improperly obtained and that the state had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had participated in disposing of Tara Grinstead's body. They also pointed to inconsistencies in Bo Duke's testimony, asserting that it undermined the credibility of the case against Duke. Bo Dukes, meanwhile, pursued appeals focused on the severity of his sentence and the fairness of his trial. His legal team highlighted that he had cooperated with authorities and voluntarily confessed years after the crime, arguing that the 25-year sentence was disproportionately harsh given the circumstances. While the courts reviewed these appeals, the state's ability to further prosecute aspects of the case was increasingly constrained by time. The statute of limitations emerged as a central issue. Several charges that could have been filed in connection with Tara's death, including those involving obstruction and certain forms of evidence tampering, were no longer viable due to the passage of time. Compounding these challenges were questions about the investigative timeline. Critics argued that crucial leads had been missed or not pursued aggressively in the early stages of the case, which may have contributed to the lengthy delay in resolving it. Defense teams leveraged this criticism to question the reliability of later evidence and the fairness of the judicial process. In the aftermath of the trials, Tara's family and legal advocates expressed frustration with the fragmented outcome. The split verdicts, shifting narratives, and legal ambiguities left many with the sense that justice had been only partially served. While someone had been held accountable for concealing her death, no one had been definitively convicted for the murder itself. Despite the limitations imposed by law, investigators continued to treat the case as open in certain respects. They acknowledged that additional evidence or new testimony could still lead to further action. However, absent a full confession or new forensic discovery, the legal avenues appeared increasingly narrow. The appeals process underscored the complexity of cold case prosecutions. After so many years, memories fade, evidence degrades, and legal protections harden. What remained clear was that the system had struggled to deliver a conclusive resolution. Tara Grinstead's case had tested the limits of criminal justice, not just in the investigation, but in the courtroom as well. Despite years of investigation, multiple arrests, and courtroom proceedings, the Tara Grinstead case remains haunted by unanswered questions. One of the most significant is the precise sequence of events that occurred on the night she disappeared. Testimonies conflicted, key details were vague, and no physical evidence directly linked either suspect to the scene at the exact moment of the crime. The contrasting statements of Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes remain at the center of these unresolved issues. While Duke initially confessed to the murder, he later claimed he had fabricated the confession out of fear. Bo Dukes, on the other hand, asserted that Duke told him he had killed Tara and enlisted his help in disposing of her body. Their accounts diverged significantly, with each distancing themselves from the most serious responsibility. Efforts to locate Tara's remains were unsuccessful. Authorities searched the pecan orchard where Bo Dukes claimed her body was burned, but no identifiable remains were recovered. The absence of physical evidence from the scene limited the ability to corroborate the testimonies. This also left Tara's family without a grave, without a proper place to mourn, and without the closure that the recovery of remains might have provided. Investigators revisited earlier leads to see if they had missed signs or testimonies that could now be reevaluated in light of the new developments. Some early persons of interest, previously dismissed, were reconsidered, though no new arrests were made. The possibility that other individuals might have had knowledge of the crime or were involved to some degree could not be ruled out. Public scrutiny remained intense. Online communities and independent researchers continued to analyze every public record, court document, and interview transcript. Discrepancies between the original investigation and later revelations led many to speculate about investigative missteps. Some questioned why certain leads were not more aggressively pursued in the early days. Tara's family repeatedly appealed to the public for any information that might help fully close the case. Their hope was that someone, somewhere, still held a piece of the truth that had yet to come to light. Over the years, they expressed both gratitude for the support they had received and anguish over the case's lingering gaps. Ultimately, the case left behind more than legal files and evidence logs. It left a community grappling with the possibility that the full truth might never be known. The arrest and conviction of individuals provided partial accountability, but not resolution. What exactly happened to Tara Grinstead, and why, remains a question that continues to weigh heavily on all those who knew her and followed her story. The disappearance and death of Tara Grinstead marked a turning point for Ocilla, Georgia, a town that had seldom seen itself reflected in headlines beyond its county borders. The years-long search for answers tested the resilience of the community, the tenacity of law enforcement, and the endurance of a family determined not to let her memory fade. In the classrooms of Irwin County High School, where Tara once taught history, her absence was deeply felt long after her disappearance. Students and colleagues who knew her remembered her dedication, her presence at school events, and her role as a mentor in the lives of young people. Annual events and vigils were held to honor her legacy, and her name became a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can be derailed by violence. Tara's case also reshaped public understanding of how cold cases can be re-examined in the modern age. The impact of media, especially the Up and Vanished podcast, demonstrated the power of public engagement in prompting action where traditional efforts had stalled. Though the podcast did not directly solve the case, it helped create the conditions that led individuals with critical knowledge to speak out. The legal outcomes, while offering a measure of accountability, did not erase the lingering sense of loss. No full confession ever pieced together a complete picture. No remains were recovered. No singular narrative was universally accepted. What the case revealed was not only the brutality of the crime, but the limitations of the justice system in confronting cases where time erodes both memory and evidence. Still, Tara Grinstead's name remains alive in public memory. Her story has been the subject of documentaries, forums, academic studies on cold cases, and discussions about victims' rights. For many, she became a symbol of perseverance, not only in life, but in the fight to uncover what happened to her. In Irwin County, her former students have grown up, some pursuing careers inspired by her example. Her family, while scarred by years of uncertainty, has continued to advocate for missing persons and push for reforms in how such cases are handled. They've urged authorities and the public to never allow silence, fear, or time to bury the truth. Tara's legacy endures not because of the manner in which she died, but because of the life she lived and the determination of those who refused to forget her. Her case remains a powerful testament to the importance of persistence in community, in law enforcement, and in the pursuit of justice. On the evening of May 13, 1997, Midwest City, Oklahoma seemed like any other small suburban town, calm, predictable, and secure. In a modest home on 15th Street, 8-year-old Kirsten Hatfield went to bed around 11:30 p.m. after spending time with her family. The second grader had just finished her day like countless others, doing homework, watching television, and brushing her teeth before bed. Her mother, Shannon Hazen, ensured her daughter was settled in for the night in the bedroom they shared. Kirsten, a petite girl with long dark hair and a reserved smile, was known in her neighborhood for her polite demeanor and quiet presence. She lived with her mother and younger sister in a single-story rental house located in a tightly knit community where neighbors knew one another by name. Their home was modest but filled with signs of everyday life: school books, toys, and family photographs. That night, the blinds on the window by Kirsten's bed were drawn. Her pink Barbie nightgown hung on a chair. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The neighborhood's quiet was occasionally broken by barking dogs or the rumble of a passing car, but no one reported any unusual activity. Kirsten's mother went to sleep believing everything was as it should be. The calm of the evening gave no indication of the events that would unfold in the dark hours ahead. events that would plunge a family into a nightmare and leave a community shaken. By morning, that fragile sense of normalcy would be shattered. At approximately 6 a.m. on May 14, 1997, Shannon Hazen awoke to a haunting discovery. Her daughter, Kirsten Hatfield, was missing. The bed where Kirsten had lain the night before was empty. The window beside her bed was slightly ajar, the screen removed and resting on the ground outside. Panic set in immediately. The child's absence was confirmed in moments, and Shannon called the police. Responding officers arrived quickly, treating the disappearance as a possible abduction. Early observations at the scene were chilling. The window appeared to be the entry point. Outside, investigators found small spots of blood on the windowsill and the adjacent fence. More drops were located in the backyard, leading toward a side gate. Kirsten's underwear was discovered in the backyard, further heightening suspicions of foul play. Police and volunteers began searching the surrounding area. Law enforcement canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with residents and collecting any available information. Search teams combed nearby fields, ditches, and wooded areas. Aerial support was brought in, and scent tracking dogs were used in hopes of locating the missing girl. Despite these efforts, no sign of Kirsten was found. Her disappearance, marked by a few pieces of physical evidence and no eyewitnesses, posed a daunting challenge. Officers described the abduction as highly targeted. There were no signs of forced entry at any door, and the only disruption was the tampered window. By the afternoon, media crews had arrived. Kirsten's photograph, her youthful face framed by dark hair, was broadcast across television screens and printed in newspapers. Her family made emotional appeals, urging the public to come forward with any information. But leads were scarce, and no one had seen or heard anything unusual. For her mother and younger sister, the home was no longer a place of safety. The room where Kirsten once slept had become a site of fear and mystery. The hope that she had wandered off quickly gave way to a terrifying realization. Kirsten had been taken, and whoever had done it had vanished without a trace. From the earliest hours following Kirsten Hatfield's disappearance, the Midwest City Police Department launched an extensive investigation. Detectives treated the case as a child abduction from the start. The physical evidence found outside the bedroom window, blood droplets, the removed screen, and Kirsten's underwear, suggested a deliberate and swift intrusion. There was no indication of a break-in at the front or back doors. The window, slightly raised and easily accessible from outside, became the focal point of the crime scene. Investigators conducted door-to-door interviews, speaking with residents in the surrounding blocks. Officers asked whether anyone had seen suspicious individuals or vehicles the night before. Few had. No one reported hearing a struggle or seeing Kirsten leave the house. The silence of the night compounded the confusion and deepened the mystery. FBI agents joined the investigation, bringing resources to assist local authorities. A task force formed quickly, dedicating personnel solely to the case. Forensic teams examined the home and collected biological samples for analysis. DNA technology was in use but limited in scope. The small amount of blood found was preserved, though it couldn't yet yield a suspect's identity. Investigators hoped it would someday prove useful. Attention soon turned to potential suspects. Anyone with access to Kirsten or knowledge of the home's layout came under scrutiny. Known sex offenders in the area were interviewed. Family members, neighbors, and acquaintances were questioned. Background checks were run. Though a few leads emerged, none proved substantial enough to make an arrest. Media interest intensified. Kirsten's image was circulated through flyers, posters, and news reports. Volunteers joined organized searches across vacant lots and wooded patches. Yet, Despite growing public awareness, there were no credible sightings or tips that brought police closer to finding her. Months passed. Detectives rechecked interviews, reanalyzed evidence, and followed every new lead. Each time, the trail ended. Despite their exhaustive efforts, there was no suspect, no motive, and no sign of Kirsten. The case grew colder with each passing week, leaving investigators frustrated and a family desperate for answers. The quiet neighborhood that had once been a sanctuary now bore a scar that wouldn't fade. By early 1998, nearly a year after Kirsten Hatfield vanished, the investigation had slowed. Leads had dried up. Despite the efforts of law enforcement and repeated public appeals, the case showed no movement. The bright yellow flyers that once covered Midwest City's telephone poles and storefronts had faded or been removed. Hope was still present, but it had dulled with time. The Hatfield family lived in the shadow of uncertainty. Kirsten's mother, Shannon, remained in the same home for a time, unwilling to leave in case her daughter returned. Her room was left untouched. The memories, the waiting, and the constant anxiety took an emotional toll that became part of their daily life. Each year, the anniversary of Kirsten's disappearance passed with renewed pleas for information. Detectives reviewed the case periodically. They revisited early interviews and rechecked physical evidence. In the absence of a body, the case remained open but stagnant. Over the years, new investigators cycled through the department. Some studied the case file, which had grown thick with reports, photos, and statements. It remained a haunting presence in the cold case archives, labeled but unsolved. Public attention waned. Other crimes emerged. Priorities shifted. But within the department, Kirsten's case never closed. The absence of closure was profound. Kirsten had not simply disappeared, she had been taken. Her case remained one of Midwest City's most troubling mysteries, defined by what was missing: a suspect, a resolution, and most tragically, the child herself. Meanwhile, advances in forensic science were underway. DNA testing, still in its relative infancy in the late 1990s, would evolve over the next 2 decades. Although the biological evidence collected early on could not provide clear answers then, it was carefully preserved, waiting for a time when it might speak more clearly. For Shannon and the rest of Kirsten's family, the waiting never stopped. Birthdays passed without candles. Holidays came without celebration. The bedroom remained a monument to a life interrupted. In the years following Kirsten Hatfield's disappearance, forensic science underwent rapid transformation. DNA analysis, once a slow and limited tool, became a cornerstone of modern criminal investigations. Laboratories adopted new techniques that allowed scientists to extract and analyze genetic material from increasingly smaller and more degraded samples. For cold cases like Kirsten's, these developments represented a possible path forward. During the early 2000s, crime labs began implementing short tandem repeat (STR) analysis. This technique could isolate specific genetic markers and match them with high confidence to individuals. Additionally, national DNA databases expanded, most notably the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, which allowed law enforcement agencies to compare evidence across jurisdictions. Midwest City Police, aware of these advancements, ensured the biological samples collected in 1997 were stored under proper conditions. The small traces of blood found on the window and fence, once tested with inconclusive results, were periodically re-examined as technology improved. Each attempt represented a quiet hope that science would one day reveal what had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. Cold case units in many departments began to revisit long unsolved files, encouraged by successful DNA identifications in other jurisdictions. These breakthroughs demonstrated how modern techniques could succeed, where older methods had failed. In several high-profile cases, suspects were identified and convicted using evidence that had been preserved, but not previously decipherable. Though Kirsten's file remained in storage, it was never forgotten. Investigators knew the case hinged on the physical evidence recovered in 1997. It was a matter of time, funding, and the right expertise to re-examine the samples under the latest standards. By 2015, a renewed interest in solving cold cases had taken root across Oklahoma. Some departments had assigned detectives specifically to long unsolved crimes. These officers, often younger and trained in the latest forensic methods, brought a fresh perspective to cases once considered unworkable. It was in this climate that Kirsten Hatfield's case was picked up again, this time with technology finally capable of unlocking the truth. In 2015, a detective newly assigned to cold cases in Midwest City pulled the Hatfield file from storage. The thick binder, aged and weathered, contained hundreds of pages of interviews, lab reports, and photographs. Nearly 2 decades had passed since Kirsten's disappearance, but the case still loomed large within the department. The decision to revisit the file was driven by both experience and emerging forensic capability. Among the preserved evidence were biological samples that had never been conclusively linked to a suspect. The detective requested that the crime scene DNA be reanalyzed using the most advanced techniques then available. This re-examination led to a breakthrough. A DNA profile developed from the blood on Kirsten's bedroom window and fence matched an entry in the National CODIS database. The profile belonged to Anthony Joseph Palma, a man who had lived just 2 doors down from the Hatfield residence at the time of Kirsten's abduction. Palma had not been a central figure in the original investigation. He had been interviewed in 1997, like other neighbors, but gave no indication of involvement. He had no prior convictions for violent crimes, and no record that would have made him a strong suspect at the time. Yet now, the match between his DNA and the evidence collected from the scene could not be ignored. Surveillance was initiated to collect a fresh DNA sample covertly for confirmation. Investigators obtained material from his trash, used items discarded from his home. The DNA from those items matched the blood found outside Kirsten's bedroom window with certainty. That evidence, preserved for 18 years, now pointed to a suspect. Anthony Palma was arrested on October 12, 2015. Search warrants were executed at his home. Among the items recovered were journals, personal effects, and documents. The search focused not only on finding additional evidence linking him to the crime, but also on seeking any clue to Kirsten's fate. Her body had never been found. The arrest made headlines. Palma's quiet presence in the neighborhood had raised no suspicion for years. He had continued to live near the site of the abduction, even as the case remained unsolved. His proximity and familiarity with the area made the revelation even more disturbing. For law enforcement, the DNA match was a vindication of years of work and careful evidence preservation. For Kirsten's family, it was a sudden, unexpected jolt, a glimmer of justice long deferred. Anthony Palma, 56 at the time of his arrest, was taken into custody quietly at his residence in Midwest City. The shock reverberated through the neighborhood. Palma had lived just 2 doors down from the Hatfield home at the time of Kirsten's disappearance and had remained in the same house ever since. To many in the area, he had been an unremarkable figure, quiet, solitary, and largely unnoticed. Following the DNA confirmation, Palma was charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. The charges reflected the belief that Kirsten had been abducted and killed, though her remains had never been found. Investigators stated that the DNA match between Palma and the blood found at the abduction site was statistically conclusive. It placed him at the window where Kirsten had last been seen, and near the fence where her blood and underwear were recovered. The arrest affidavit revealed chilling details. Palma had been among the original list of people interviewed in 1997, but had provided no useful information. He denied any involvement and claimed to know little about the family, yet the DNA linked him directly to the scene. Investigators theorized that Palma, familiar with the home and its occupants, had exploited the layout and the family's routines to commit the abduction under the cover of darkness. When police searched Palma's home in 2015, they discovered child-related items, including photographs and literature. Some materials suggested an interest in young girls, though none were directly linked to Kirsten. These findings reinforced investigators' suspicions that Palma's actions were premeditated. Neighbors reacted with disbelief. Palma had lived quietly for decades, maintaining his home and interacting minimally with others. Some recalled seeing him around during the original investigation, but had never suspected his involvement. The revelation that he had remained in the community, just steps from where Kirsten had been taken, was deeply unsettling. For law enforcement, the arrest marked a significant breakthrough in one of the region's most haunting cold cases. For Kirsten's family, the development brought a mix of emotions: relief that a suspect had been identified, but also sorrow that the child's fate remained unknown. Palma was denied bond and held in the Oklahoma County Jail pending trial. The case was no longer about a missing child. It had become a homicide, built on the silent but damning testimony of preserved DNA. Anthony Palma's trial began in 2017, nearly 2 years after his arrest. The courtroom in Oklahoma County was packed with observers, including members of Kirsten Hatfield's family, local residents, and media representatives. The proceedings centered on a case without a body, relying instead on physical evidence, circumstantial findings, and the strength of forensic science. The prosecution presented a detailed timeline of events, reconstructing the night of May 13, 1997. They emphasized the location of Kirsten's bed, the window left open, the screen removed, and the biological traces leading out into the yard. Most critical to their case was the DNA match between Palma and the blood found at the window and on the fence. Experts testified to the integrity of the evidence, its preservation over 18 years, and the scientific certainty of the DNA identification. The prosecution highlighted Palma's proximity to the Hatfield home and questioned why his DNA would be at the scene if he were not involved. They introduced the items found in his home that suggested a disturbing interest in children, framing them as indicative of motive. Though Kirsten's remains had never been found, prosecutors asserted that the totality of the evidence demonstrated she had been taken and killed by Palma. Palma's defense attempted to challenge the reliability of the DNA evidence, arguing potential contamination and questioning the chain of custody over the long period since the original collection. They denied any wrongdoing on Palma's part and pointed out the lack of direct evidence linking him to an act of violence or to Kirsten herself, beyond the DNA. The defense emphasized the absence of a body, weapon, or witness as grounds for reasonable doubt. The jury listened to weeks of testimony, including emotional statements from Kirsten's family. They heard how the case had remained a constant source of grief and unanswered questions. The community's trauma was evident in their words and expressions. Deliberations lasted only a short time. On October 13, 2017, Anthony Palma was found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. the verdict marked the end of a 2-decade search for accountability. Palma showed no visible emotion as the decision was read. For the Hatfield family, the verdict brought a measure of justice. Though Kirsten's fate remained uncertain, someone was finally being held responsible. The trial had concluded with a conviction, affirming what investigators had long suspected, that the man who had taken Kirsten had been close all along. Following his conviction, Anthony Palma faced sentencing under Oklahoma law, which allowed for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder. The courtroom was solemn as the sentence was handed down. Palma, convicted of abducting and killing Kirsten Hatfield, was ordered to spend the rest of his life in prison. During sentencing, the prosecution reiterated the devastating impact of Kirsten's disappearance. Family members delivered emotional statements, expressing the pain of living for years without answers and the anguish of knowing her final moments were likely marked by violence. Her mother spoke of birthdays missed, the silence in her home, and the irreparable loss suffered since 1997. Palma did not address the court. He remained silent throughout the proceedings, declining to offer any explanation or remorse. His demeanor remained unchanged as it had during the trial. The judge, before rendering the sentence, remarked on the gravity of the crime. Palma's calculated actions, the premeditated nature of the abduction, and his decision to remain silent for years despite living near the scene made the offense particularly disturbing. The court emphasized that even without a recovered body, the evidence presented had been overwhelming. Palma was transferred to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, a maximum security facility. His incarceration marked the end of his public visibility, but for Kirsten's family, the case was still incomplete. They had obtained a conviction, but not closure. The most painful question, where Kirsten was, remained unanswered. Public reaction to the sentencing was mixed with relief and frustration. Relief that justice, at least partially, had been served. Frustration that Palma had offered no confession, no explanation, and no information about Kirsten's final whereabouts. For the community that had mourned the loss of a child for nearly 20 years, the life sentence was a resolution but not a conclusion. The case, though closed in the legal sense, continued to live in the hearts of those affected. Kirsten Hatfield's name remained associated not only with a crime, but with the enduring struggle for justice in the face of silence and absence. Despite the conviction and life sentence of Anthony Palma, crucial aspects of Kirsten Hatfield's case remained unresolved. Foremost was the location of her body. Throughout the investigation, trial, and subsequent imprisonment, Palma never revealed where Kirsten had been taken after her abduction, nor did he offer any insight into her final moments. The absence of this information left a void no legal outcome could fill. Search efforts continued intermittently, especially following Palma's arrest. Investigators reviewed past reports, revisited areas previously examined, and consulted with forensic experts. Ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs were used in fields and wooded areas near the Hatfield home. However, no trace of Kirsten was discovered. Without a recovery site, there was no opportunity for a proper burial, no chance for forensic confirmation of cause of death, and no physical closure for the family. The case raised difficult questions for law enforcement. How had Palma managed to abduct a child from a home just feet away from his own without being seen? What did he do in the immediate aftermath? Where could he have hidden her body so effectively that 2 decades of searches yielded nothing? Investigators speculated, but without direct evidence or testimony, the details remained elusive. For Kirsten's mother, the lack of answers prolonged the trauma. While the conviction acknowledged her daughter had been murdered, it did not return her. The sense of incompletion hung over every milestone. The verdict, the sentence, the passage of time. Each year, the hope that Kirsten's remains might be found faded a little more, yet it never disappeared entirely. Community members also struggled with the unresolved elements of the case. Kirsten's story was known across Oklahoma, and her face had once been on posters and flyers throughout the state. The revelation that her abductor had been a neighbor for years disturbed many. But the silence around her fate was more haunting. It suggested that some crimes, no matter how thoroughly investigated or prosecuted, might never yield all their secrets. The unanswered questions surrounding Kirsten Hatfield's disappearance became a defining feature of the case. They served as a constant reminder of the limitations of justice when truth is withheld and silence becomes the final barrier. On January 11, 2019, less than 2 years after his conviction, Anthony Palma was found dead inside his cell at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. He was 59 years old. Prison officials confirmed that he had been killed by another inmate. An autopsy later revealed that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and neck, inflicted during an assault. Palma had been housed in a medium security unit known to contain inmates with violent records. At the time of the incident, he shared a cell with another prisoner who was later identified as the attacker. The motive behind the killing was not officially disclosed, but such incidents were not uncommon for inmates convicted of crimes against children. Palma's status as a child murderer had likely marked him among the prison population. The news of Palma's death was met with mixed emotions. Some members of the public expressed relief, viewing his death as a final consequence for the crime he had committed. Others saw it as a missed opportunity. With his death, any chance of extracting a confession or learning what had happened to Kirsten vanished. Law enforcement officials acknowledged that the case had reached its final chapter, at least from a legal perspective. There would be no further prosecutions, no appeals, no additional testimony. The man convicted of abducting and killing Kirsten Hatfield was gone, and with him likely went the last hope of recovering her remains. Kirsten's family was informed promptly. While Palma's death ended one part of their long ordeal, it also cemented the fact that some questions would remain unanswered forever. No one else had ever been implicated in the case, and there were no indications that others were involved. The only person who could have filled the final gaps in the narrative had taken that information with him. Palma was buried without public ceremony. There was no statement from his relatives, and his death received only brief attention outside of Oklahoma. For those closest to the case, it marked the conclusion of a chapter that had begun more than 2 decades earlier, but not the end of the search for truth. The prison's internal investigation into the circumstances of Palma's death concluded with the identification of the inmate responsible. No charges were filed immediately, and the event faded quickly from public discourse. The state's focus remained not on the man who had died, but on the child who had never been found. The case of Kirsten Hatfield remains one of the most haunting and enduring crimes in Oklahoma's recent history. Although a conviction was secured and the man responsible ultimately died in prison, the full story was never recovered. Kirsten's legacy lives on not only through the memory held by her family and community, but also in the broader changes her case inspired in law enforcement practices and forensic investigation. In the years following the resolution of the legal case, Midwest City Police reaffirmed their commitment to preserving evidence in all active and unsolved crimes. The Hatfield investigation demonstrated the critical importance of maintaining forensic materials, even when technology at the time couldn't extract usable results. The breakthrough that led to Anthony Palma's arrest hinged entirely on evidence collected and safeguarded in 1997. Kirsten's case also underscored the value of continuous review of cold cases. The decision to revisit the file nearly 2 decades later, prompted by a dedicated investigator, brought a long-dormant case back into motion. That initiative, reviewing older cases with new methods, was adopted more widely in Oklahoma and other jurisdictions in the years that followed. For the Hatfield family, public attention gradually faded, but private grief endured. Memorials for Kirsten were held periodically. Friends and former classmates gathered to honor her memory, particularly on anniversaries of her disappearance. A park bench, a tree planted in her name, and other quiet tributes became places where people could reflect on her life, however briefly known. Kirsten's story became part of training modules for investigators and forensic professionals. The case was studied in criminology and forensic science programs, illustrating both the devastating consequences of child abduction and the evolving power of DNA evidence. Her name, once appearing on missing persons posters, was now cited in lectures and case reviews as an example of perseverance in the pursuit of justice. Though she never returned home, Kirsten Hatfield's case changed the trajectory of how similar crimes are handled. It served as a reminder that even in the absence of a body, a case can be solved. It reinforced the idea that cold cases are never truly closed, and that the silence of years can eventually be broken by science, persistence, and renewed determination. Today, her absence still echoes in the lives of those who loved her, but her legacy lives in the systems that now seek to ensure that such tragedies are not repeated in silence. Bay Village, Ohio, nestled along the southern shore of Lake Erie, had long prided itself on its tranquility. With tree-lined streets and a population hovering around 16,000 in the late 1980s, the town epitomized suburban comfort. Families moved there for the promise of safe neighborhoods, reputable schools, and a sense of closeness often elusive in larger cities. Children rode bikes freely, neighbors greeted each other warmly, and front doors were rarely locked. In the autumn of 1989, the leaves turned to deep shades of amber and crimson, casting a golden hue over the streets. Among the residents was a 5th grade student named Amy Mihalyevich. 10 years old, Amy lived with her mother, Margaret, and her older brother in a modest home near the heart of town. Her father, who had separated from Margaret, remained involved in his children's lives. Amy was well-liked, known for her vibrant personality, love of horses, and an emerging interest in writing. She was enrolled at Bay Middle School and had recently joined the school's gifted and talented program. The Mihaljevits had moved to Bay Village from Little Rock, Arkansas, a few years earlier. Margaret worked at Trading Times magazine in Cleveland, and her job often required her to commute. Amy had adjusted well to her new surroundings, quickly making friends and becoming active in local youth activities. She walked to school most days and occasionally stopped at the Bay Village Square Shopping Center, a popular meeting place for local kids, just a short distance from the school. On the morning of October 27, 1989, the Mihaljevich household began its day as usual. Amy left for school with her backpack, her demeanor reportedly calm and routine. She had told a few friends earlier that week about plans to go to the shopping plaza that afternoon to meet someone. She mentioned receiving a phone call from a man who claimed he wanted to help her choose a gift for her mother, who had recently received a promotion at work. The man said he would meet her after school to buy the gift together, as a surprise. What Amy didn't realize, and what her friends could not fully grasp, was that she was being lured into a trap. The day passed quietly until the early evening when Amy did not return home. Her mother, concerned but not immediately alarmed, began calling neighbors and friends. As dusk gave way to night, worry turned to panic. Margaret called the Bay Village Police Department, reporting her daughter missing. The police responded swiftly, given the unusual circumstances and Amy's age. Within hours, a search was underway. For a community that had long lived under the illusion of safety, the news struck with sudden violence. Posters went up overnight. Residents formed search parties. Schools and churches opened their doors for volunteer efforts. Children were warned not to talk to strangers. The tight-knit town, once characterized by its quiet evenings and secure streets, had entered a new, unsettling reality. This chapter in Bay Village's history marked not only the disappearance of a child, but also the loss of innocence for an entire community. As law enforcement began its investigation, residents grappled with fear and confusion. Who was the man that Amy trusted? How did he gain her confidence? And why had he chosen her? In the days to come, these questions would echo through news reports, school hallways, and family dinners as the search for Amy Mihaljevic intensified and the foundation of the town's serenity was irrevocably shaken. October 27, 1989, began like any other crisp autumn Friday in Bay Village. At Bay Middle School, the day proceeded without disruption. Amy Mihaljevic attended her classes, socialized with friends, and gave no outward sign that anything was amiss. But as the final bell rang and students began to disperse, Amy followed through on a plan known only to a select few of her peers. Around 2 p.m., Amy left school and made her way to the Bay Village Square shopping center. Dressed in green pants, a lavender windbreaker, and carrying a denim book bag, she was last seen near the plaza, standing outside the Baskin-Robbins ice cream shop. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing her in the company of a man. Descriptions varied slightly, but many agreed he was white, in his 30s, and had medium-length brown hair. Amy appeared calm, not in distress, suggesting she knew, or at least trusted the person. This man had called her at home days earlier, posing as someone who worked with her mother. He claimed he wanted to buy a gift for Margaret Mihaljevic in celebration of her job promotion, and asked Amy to help him pick something out. It was a carefully constructed deception, and Amy, eager to do something kind for her mother, had agreed. What exactly happened after Amy met the man remains unknown. By the time her mother returned home from work and discovered Amy wasn't there, darkness had begun to fall. She started calling friends, teachers, and neighbors. No one had seen Amy since she left school. Margaret contacted the Bay Village Police Department at approximately 5:58 p.m., triggering a rapid response. Officers arrived at the Mihaljevic home and conducted initial interviews. Based on the unusual circumstances, a young girl disappearing after school without a trace, police quickly escalated the case. A missing child report was filed, and the FBI was contacted within hours. By nightfall, officers were canvassing the plaza, interviewing employees at local stores, and searching nearby wooded areas. Police dogs were brought in, and helicopters equipped with searchlights hovered above. The community mobilized instantly. Volunteers posted flyers, walked routes Amy might have taken, and checked garages, parks, and ditches. Early interviews with Amy's classmates revealed the chilling detail. She had confided to several friends about the call and her planned meeting at the plaza. Investigators now had a vital clue. The abductor had likely called Amy's home, meaning phone records and call tracing would be crucial. But tracing calls in 1989 lacked the immediacy of modern digital tools. It required methodical work, time, and cooperation from phone companies. In the days that followed, leads were chased and theories explored. Police considered the possibility of a stranger abduction, but the prearranged meeting suggested premeditation and familiarity. Amy had not been forcibly taken from the plaza, she had gone willingly. That distinction narrowed the profile of the suspect, someone capable of winning a child's trust, possibly with knowledge of her family. Local media covered the case intensely. Images of Amy's smiling face, with her light brown hair and bright eyes, became omnipresent. Vigils were held. Classmates wrote letters, hoping she would read them somehow. A reward was offered. The disappearance became not just a Bay Village crisis, but a regional and then national concern. Despite all efforts, days turned into weeks without any sign of Amy. No credible sightings, no ransom demands, and no new calls. The trail seemed to grow colder with each passing hour. Yet, investigators continued their work, determined to find out who had lured a 10-year-old girl from her familiar town square and why she hadn't come home. By early November, the search had expanded to surrounding counties. Police checked abandoned buildings, fields, and rest stops. Amy's school books and backpack were missing. The denim book bag, a potential key to identifying her abductor's route or intent, was never recovered. Parents across Ohio, and indeed the nation, grew more cautious. The Amy Mihaljevic case had touched a nerve, illustrating that even in the safest communities, unseen dangers could lie in wait. The plaza, once a place of after-school freedom, now bore the weight of unanswered questions and silent fears. For Amy's family, the agony of not knowing was immediate and constant. They left a light on every night. Her room was left unchanged. Each morning brought hope, and each night deepened despair. All the while, the investigation continued, increasingly complex and emotionally charged. The community waited, so did law enforcement. And somewhere, someone knew exactly what had happened in that plaza. Someone who had watched Amy walk away. In the hours following Amy Mihaljevic's disappearance, the Bay Village Police Department launched a full-scale investigation. The urgency of the case, combined with the unsettling details of her last known whereabouts, drew immediate support from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Given the calculated manner of the abduction, investigators concluded early that this was not a random snatch and grab. The case was classified as a likely abduction by a non-family member, an FBI priority. Local officers, assisted by federal agents, began by retracing Amy's steps on October 27th. Witnesses at the Bay Village Square were re-interviewed, and composite sketches of the unidentified man seen with Amy were developed. These drawings, based on often inconsistent descriptions, circulated widely through the media and were posted in businesses, schools, and post offices. Margaret Mihaljevic provided investigators with all known information, including details of the mysterious phone call Amy had received. Police traced the origin of calls made to the Mihaljevic residence but faced technological limitations. Caller ID was not widely used in 1989, and without a recorded line or exact time, investigators relied on phone company records and neighborhood testimonies. A search of Amy's room yielded little beyond typical personal items: a journal, school supplies, and her horse-themed decorations. Her notebooks and school assignments showed no clues. The family's home phone was checked for fingerprints and any physical evidence that might have been left by the caller, though no useful prints were found. With no sign of Amy by Halloween, volunteers formed neighborhood patrols and combed through woods, parks, and open lots. Law enforcement reached out to postal workers, delivery drivers, and utility employees who might have seen something unusual. The plaza was meticulously searched. Trash bins, nearby fields, and drainage ditches were examined. Dogs trained in tracking were brought in, but could not establish a trail beyond the shopping center. Leads came in daily, hundreds of tips from across Ohio and neighboring states. Every reported sighting, overheard conversation, or suspicious vehicle was documented and evaluated. Several men in the area were questioned, including those with previous records involving minors. No arrests were made. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit offered a profile of the likely perpetrator. A man with knowledge of the area, perhaps in his 30s or 40s, likely unmarried or divorced, possibly holding a job that gave him free time during school hours. The careful manipulation of Amy pointed to someone experienced in deception and possibly involved in similar prior behavior. This analysis helped guide interviews, but produced no immediate suspects. Attention also turned to the school. Investigators examined student records, school staff, and recent visitors. Amy's friends and teachers were interviewed multiple times. One troubling realization emerged. Amy wasn't the only child who had received unusual phone calls. Other girls in nearby communities reported being contacted by a man who said he worked with their mother or father. In each case, the man attempted to arrange a meeting under the pretense of buying a gift for the parent. These reports suggested that Amy's abductor had attempted his ruse more than once, and possibly had been planning for weeks or months. Authorities assembled a task force combining local, state, and federal resources. The case attracted national media attention, putting pressure on law enforcement to produce results. Investigators cross-referenced their findings with data from other missing children cases, but no direct links were found. To the public, updates were delivered through press conferences. Amy's family appeared in front of cameras, pleading for her safe return. Law enforcement provided general overviews, but held back certain key details to preserve the integrity of the investigation. Behind the scenes, agents continued to comb through hundreds of pages of phone logs, tip sheets, and interviews. The Mihailovich case database grew exponentially. Files were sorted by category: vehicle sightings, similar abduction attempts, phone scam patterns, and known sex offenders in the region. The FBI created a computer system specifically to manage the influx of information. Still, the central question remained unanswered. Who had taken Amy, and where had they taken her? Days stretched into weeks. Despite the tireless work, every lead seemed to end in frustration. There was no crime scene, no physical evidence, and no contact from the abductor. It was as if Amy had vanished into thin air. Still, investigators persisted. They revisited witnesses, re-examined earlier interviews, and refined their theories. The presence of similar phone lures across multiple towns hinted at a more elaborate operation. The man who contacted Amy may have stalked her first, gathering details needed to make his call convincing. He knew her mother's work schedule, that she would be alone after school, and how to exploit her sense of trust. By Thanksgiving, a month had passed with no breakthroughs. Law enforcement continued to coordinate searches, distribute flyers, and pursue new tips. Amy's name had become familiar across the country, her face etched into the minds of millions. The public held its breath, hoping that the next press conference would bring good news. It never came. Winter came early in northern Ohio in 1990. Snow blanketed the fields, covering the roadsides and woodlands in silence. For over 3 months, Amy Mihaljevich's disappearance had haunted Bay Village and the surrounding communities. Despite exhaustive efforts, no confirmed trace of hers had surfaced. The story had slowly faded from the headlines, but for her family and investigators, the search never paused. On February 8, 1990, a woman walking her dog in rural Ashland County came across something in a field off County Road 1181, just east of U.S. Route 250. She had noticed scattered debris in the area, what appeared to be pieces of clothing, and a small pile of disturbed soil. Upon closer inspection, she discovered the remains of a child. Local authorities quickly responded. The scene was cordoned off, and the FBI was notified. The area, a desolate stretch of farmland about 50 miles southwest of Bay Village, had no nearby structures and little regular traffic. It was a place where someone could remain unseen, especially in the colder months when crops had been harvested and the land lay bare. The remains were partially exposed, clothing consistent with what Amy was last seen wearing, green pants and a lavender windbreaker, was found nearby. Her body showed signs of decomposition, but enough remained to allow for a preliminary identification. Dental records confirmed what investigators had feared. The body was Amy Mihaljevic. The news reverberated through Bay Village. Months of hope collapsed into grief. That same day, a press conference confirmed her death. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. An autopsy revealed trauma consistent with blunt force injury. She had likely died shortly after being abducted, though the exact time of death was unclear due to the condition of the body. Amy's ears were pierced, but her earrings, small horse-shaped studs, were missing. Her denim book bag and several other personal items were also never recovered. Investigators believe the killer may have kept these items as trophies or discarded them elsewhere. These missing objects became central to the continuing investigation. The discovery of her body shifted the case from a search to a murder investigation. Law enforcement refocused efforts on the geography of the dump site. How familiar was the killer with Ashland County? Was the location chosen at random, or was it a place known to him? FBI profilers theorized the killer had selected the site deliberately, far enough to avoid immediate detection, but close enough to be reachable within a couple hours. The field where Amy was found became the focal point of a renewed canvassing effort. Residents were interviewed. Road access was mapped. Any vehicle seen in the area around the time of her disappearance, even months earlier, was reinvestigated. Despite this, no one in the sparsely populated region reported anything out of the ordinary. The field had likely been used before snowfall, and then remained untouched for weeks. Back in Bay Village, Amy's family faced the brutal finality of the discovery. The hope that she might return home alive was gone. Margaret Mihaljevic made a public statement, thanking those who had helped search for Amy and asking for privacy as they grieved. A funeral service was held, attended by hundreds. Friends, classmates, and strangers all mourned the loss of a child who had become a symbol of vulnerability and injustice. The FBI and Bay Village police redoubled their investigative efforts. Evidence recovered from the scene was limited. The elements had degraded much of what could have been crucial. No murder weapon was found. Soil samples, fiber traces, and biological material were collected. But the state of forensic science in 1990 limited what could be done. Investigators revisited the timeline. From the moment Amy left the plaza on October 27th to the discovery of her body on February 8th, her movements were unknown. Where was she taken? Was she held somewhere briefly? Or was she killed shortly after the abduction? These questions remained unanswered. The theory that she was murdered soon after being lured from the plaza gained traction, especially given the remote location of the body. In the months that followed, police pursued new angles. They studied road maps for patterns in known child abduction cases. They examined construction records, looking for workers familiar with both Bay Village and Ashland County. Registered sex offenders within a 2-hour radius were reviewed again. Interviews were reconducted. The behavioral profile was updated to reflect the details of the crime scene. Despite their efforts, no suspect was named, no arrests were made. The case began to evolve into one of the most disturbing unsolved child murders in Ohio's history. Investigators refused to call it cold, insisting it remained active, but leads dwindled. The field in Ashland County was cleared and returned to agricultural use by spring. Nothing remained of the small, makeshift grave. But for Amy's family and those who had searched for her, it was a permanent landmark in the geography of loss. Her name, once a symbol of hope for a safe return, became a rallying cry for justice, justice that remained elusive but never abandoned. In the aftermath of the discovery in Ashland County, investigators were left with a profoundly disturbing reality and a long list of unanswered questions. The circumstances surrounding Amy Mihalojevich's disappearance and murder had exposed an elaborate and calculated crime, but the person responsible remained unidentified. One of the most perplexing elements was the method used to lure Amy. The phone call, made to her home while her mother was at work, was not a spontaneous act. The man knew enough about Margaret Mihalojevich's job to fabricate a story about a work-related gift. He knew Amy would be alone after school. He chose words carefully, using the idea of a reward for a parent to gain trust. Investigators believed this level of preparation pointed to a premeditated plan, possibly involving surveillance of the Mihaljevich family in the weeks before the abduction. Amy was not the only child to receive such a call. Other girls in nearby towns had also been contacted by a man pretending to know their parents. In each instance, he claimed to be working with a parent and invited the child to help him choose a present. While those children did not follow through, Amy had. This pattern revealed that the perpetrator may have targeted multiple children before selecting Amy. It also indicated a more expansive operation than a single crime of opportunity. Despite these insights, critical pieces remained missing. Amy's book bag and other personal items were never found. The earrings she wore that day, horse-shaped studs, were absent from the remains. These missing objects became symbolic. Investigators theorized the killer may have taken them as trophies or discarded them to eliminate evidence. Repeated searches failed to uncover these items. Flyers circulated across Ohio with images and descriptions of the earrings, but no trace ever surfaced. The autopsy left several questions unresolved. While signs of blunt force trauma were evident, there was no definitive cause of death released to the public. The timing of her death was also unclear. Was she killed within hours of her abduction, or was she held for some period before being murdered? The condition of the remains, affected by months of exposure, made it difficult to determine. Law enforcement leaned toward the theory that she was not kept alive long. Why had Amy been taken so far from home? The field in Ashland County was not a random roadside ditch. It was secluded, requiring specific knowledge of rural routes and unpatrolled land. The distance, more than 50 miles from Bay Village, suggested the perpetrator had access to transportation and enough time to cover his tracks. But investigators found no direct connection between Amy's family and anyone living near the location where her body was found. Forensic science offered limited help in 1990. DNA testing existed but was in its early stages. No usable biological material was recovered from Amy's body that could be matched to a suspect. No weapon was recovered. No fibers or fingerprints from an unknown source were found at the scene. The field offered no surveillance, no witnesses, and no clues to what vehicle may have carried her there. As the months passed, law enforcement expanded the scope of their investigation. They examined cases of missing or murdered children across the Midwest for potential similarities. A few drew comparisons. girls of similar age, similar tactics, but none offered a definitive link. The FBI also looked into people who had previously worked or lived in both Bay Village and Ashland County. Yet no strong suspect emerged. Amy's family cooperated fully. They shared phone logs, work schedules, and all known associates. Investigators verified every recent repairman, delivery driver, and neighbor. Still, no definitive suspect surfaced. The case became an exercise in methodical elimination. Public interest in the case remained strong, but as the first anniversary approached, tips began to slow. Amy's story had become embedded in the collective memory of the region, a symbol of vulnerability. The community continued to support the Mihaljevics, but even within Bay Village, a painful shift occurred. Parents became more protective, children less free. The plaza where Amy had vanished became a place of unease. One of the most frustrating aspects for law enforcement was the seeming absence of motive. Amy was not taken for ransom. There was no apparent sexual assault indicated in public reports. No connection was found between Amy and known offenders. The abduction was not spontaneous, but what had driven the perpetrator remained unknown. Was it fantasy, control, revenge? Without knowing who had done it, investigators could only speculate about the why. The profile developed by experts was revised again. The killer was likely a man in his 30s or 40s, organized, intelligent, and capable of deception. He likely had a history of interacting with children and might have had prior offenses that had gone unreported or undetected. He may have worked in a job that gave him access to multiple communities, traveling sales, service repair, delivery. But these generalizations offered no direct path to justice. Amy Mihaljevich's case remained open. Dozens of investigators had touched it. Thousands of hours had been spent on interviews, tips, and evidence. But the trail, for all its promising starts, continued to drift into silence. Unanswered questions hung in the air. Who had planned this crime? Who had been close enough to observe Amy's life without detection? And what had he done in the days and weeks after her death? The answers were out there, somewhere. And even as the investigation stalled, those involved refused to let go. As the search for Amy Mihaljevich's killer continued into the early 1990s, investigators began to broaden their scope. They examined other abductions and murders from across the region to determine whether Amy's case fit into a larger pattern. The tactics used in her disappearance, the phone call, the manipulation, the calculated meeting in a public space, were not common, but they bore enough sophistication to suggest that the perpetrator may have acted before. Law enforcement compiled a list of similar cases involving preteen girls who had been approached or abducted under suspicious circumstances. Each was studied for potential overlap: age of the victim, geographic proximity, physical evidence, and method of approach. Though no case matched perfectly, a few stood out. In several towns surrounding Cleveland, young girls had received strange phone calls before Amy's abduction. These calls shared a common theme. The caller pretended to be someone connected to the child's family, often claiming to be buying a gift or needing help. In some cases, the girls hung up or told their parents. But others, like Amy, had not reported the calls until after the news of her disappearance broke. This pattern suggested that the person behind Amy's abduction had attempted to use his script multiple times. The implication was chilling. It wasn't an isolated impulse, but a method tested and refined. The phone calls had likely been rehearsed. He may have monitored responses, gauging which children might be more susceptible to manipulation. In reviewing unsolved child murder cases in Ohio and neighboring states, investigators looked at cases going back several years. In particular, they focused on victims with similar profiles: Girls between 9 and 12 years old, last seen in public places, whose cases remained unresolved. One case, involving a girl abducted from a shopping center in the late 1980s, shared enough surface details to warrant deeper analysis. But timelines and witness statements eventually ruled out a direct connection. There was also speculation about whether Amy's killer had struck before and would strike again. The level of planning and lack of physical evidence suggested experience. This wasn't a panicked or rushed act. The suspect had manipulated the victim, removed her from a public space without drawing attention, and transported her across county lines without being seen. He left no known forensic trace. The disposal site, chosen for its seclusion, also pointed to forethought. One of the few consistent elements across potentially related cases was the method of initial contact. In an era before caller ID and mobile phones, reaching a child at home during after-school hours was relatively easy. The abductor had taken advantage of this, calling when parents were likely at work. This approach required specific knowledge of a child's home environment, suggesting surveillance or information gathering. Another line of inquiry considered whether the killer might have had legitimate reasons to be in the community: delivery services, repairs, sales, or canvassing jobs. People in such roles often entered neighborhoods without suspicion. They could observe routines, make notes, and possibly engage children under the pretense of a work-related visit. Investigators interviewed dozens of workers fitting this profile, but no definitive link to Amy's case was established. Despite their efforts, the comparisons brought no breakthroughs. Each lead brought its own complexities and false starts. Some cases bore superficial resemblance but diverged on critical points. Others raised red flags but lacked corroborating evidence. The FBI's profiling division emphasized that while serial offenders often repeat behaviors, they also adapt. Just because Amy's case seemed unique didn't rule out a pattern. The killer may have altered his methods after her death or changed his area of operation. Some speculated that media coverage might have deterred him from attempting another crime in the same manner. Others feared he had simply become better at hiding. In the years that followed, law enforcement remained alert to any new cases that echoed Amy's. Flyers describing her earrings and the circumstances of her disappearance were kept in circulation. Police departments across the state were asked to report any incident that bore resemblance. A centralized tracking system was developed, compiling data on child abduction attempts. While none of these efforts produced a direct suspect, they underscored the possibility that Amy's case was not isolated. Whether or not her killer had acted before, the techniques he used, gaining trust, using knowledge of family, and executing a plan without a trace, made it plausible that he could act again. The comparisons also served another purpose. They kept Amy's case in active circulation within law enforcement circles. Investigators hoped that if a similar crime occurred, patterns would emerge more clearly. They also hoped that public awareness might trigger memory. Someone, somewhere, might recall a man who asked too many questions, watched children too closely, or acted suspiciously in the weeks before Amy disappeared. By the mid-1990s, the effort to identify similar cases had become part of the larger framework of the investigation. While no conclusive matches were found, the patterns identified helped shape the enduring profile of the perpetrator. Someone patient, calculating, and deliberate, who may have studied his victims for weeks before making contact. Amy Mihalevich's case stood as a stark warning. The tactics used against her had not been random. They were part of a script, one that might have been used before and could be used again. And as long as the man behind that script remained unidentified, the threat he posed remained unresolved. As the 1990s gave way to a new century, the case of Amy Mihaljevic remained unsolved. Yet, the evolution of forensic science began to breathe new life into investigations once stalled by the limitations of their time. Technological advancements, particularly in DNA analysis, digital databases, and trace evidence processing, opened possibilities that had not existed when Amy disappeared in 1989. At the time of her abduction, forensic capabilities were constrained by the tools available. DNA testing was in its infancy, primarily limited to blood typing and rudimentary genetic comparisons. The amount of biological material required for a match was far greater than modern thresholds, and the turnaround time for analysis could stretch into months. Now, years later, those limitations were rapidly diminishing. Amy's case files, which had remained active but quiet, were revisited by a new generation of investigators. Among the preserved evidence were items recovered from the scene where her body had been found. Fragments of her clothing, fibers, soil samples, and a single human hair not immediately matched to any known source. These pieces were sent for re-examination using updated forensic methods. In particular, mitochondrial DNA testing, capable of producing results from older, degraded biological material, was applied to the unknown hair. While it did not yield a conclusive match, it allowed investigators to rule out a number of previously considered suspects. More importantly, it created a data point for future comparison. Should a suspect be identified through other means? Parallel to biological testing was the improvement of databases. Systems like CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, and VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, allowed local law enforcement to compare details from Amy's case against a nationwide registry of violent crimes and known offenders. Amy's DNA profile, along with partial prints and forensic data, was entered into these systems. Though no immediate match was found, the case was now electronically connected to a broader investigative web. Fiber analysis also evolved. Advances in microscopy and chemical analysis meant that fibers from Amy's clothing, or the crime scene, could be more precisely identified. This process, while meticulous and often inconclusive without a suspect to compare against, narrowed down possibilities. A few synthetic fibers recovered near the body site, originally thought to be environmental contamination, were found to be consistent with certain types of carpeting or upholstery used in vehicles during the late 1980s. This detail suggested Amy may have been transported in a specific kind of car or van. In addition to retesting physical evidence, law enforcement began leveraging digital tools to reassemble timelines and map out geographic profiles. Amy's known movements, locations of similar cases, and demographic data were fed into Geographic Information Systems, GIS, to model likely routes and potential areas of interest. These visualizations helped refine theories about where the abductor may have lived or worked. The growing use of familial DNA, a method that identifies genetic relatives of a potential suspect, was considered as well. While Amy's case predated widespread collection of suspect DNA profiles, the emergence of public genealogy databases presented a new frontier. Law enforcement explored the possibility of cross-referencing unidentified DNA from the crime scene against genealogical data, although legal and privacy concerns slowed the process. The FBI and Bay Village investigators also began contacting families of other missing children in nearby regions, seeking permission to retest old evidence using new techniques. Several cold cases were reopened as part of this effort, though no direct links to Amy's case were established. Public support for revisiting the case remained strong, Advances in media technology meant that Amy's story could be reintroduced to new audiences via online archives, podcasts, and documentary specials. These renewals often resulted in fresh tips, as viewers responded with memories or suspicions sparked by renewed exposure to the details. One particularly promising lead came from a tipster who, after viewing a televised report on the forensics updates, contacted authorities to report a man who had once lived near Bay Village and fit the original description. This man had since moved out of state and had a history of deceptive behavior involving minors. He had not previously been investigated. His DNA was collected and compared against the crime scene evidence, but the result was inconclusive. Though not cleared entirely, he remained one of several persons of interest. The application of new forensics did not result in a conclusive identification of Amy's killer. However, it significantly narrowed the field. Several earlier suspects were definitively excluded. Investigative resources were now concentrated on fewer, more plausible individuals. The case was no longer considered stagnant. The advances also reinforced key conclusions. The planning behind Amy's abduction, the absence of random violence, and the careful selection of a remote dump site all pointed to a specific psychological profile, one consistent with individuals who have committed similar crimes elsewhere. It supported the long-held belief that this was not the perpetrator's first or only offense. Investigators continued to emphasize that time had not diminished the urgency of the case. Forensics had given them new tools, but they still needed the right piece of information, the final connection to close the case. Each advancement brought them closer to that goal. Amy Mihaljevic had been gone for more than a decade, yet the promise of scientific progress kept hope alive. The evidence, though aged and fragile, had not been forgotten. It waited, preserved, studied, and reanalyzed, ready to speak again when the technology and timing aligned. From the moment Amy Mihaljevic was reported missing, public interest in her case surged. The unusual circumstances of her disappearance, the vividness of her last known location, and the deep emotional response it triggered in the community made the case one of the most high-profile child abductions in Ohio's history. Over time, the role of the media and public engagement evolved into a central element in both maintaining awareness and driving investigative momentum. Initially, local news outlets covered the story intensely. Amy's face, smiling, her light brown hair neatly parted, appeared on television screens and in newspapers across Northeast Ohio. Her image was soon printed on flyers distributed across towns and pinned to bulletin boards in schools, libraries, and storefront windows. As the days passed without news, her case moved into the national spotlight. Major networks began broadcasting updates, often leading evening newscasts with appeals for information. Publicity was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought valuable attention, keeping Amy's disappearance in the minds of millions. On the other, it overwhelmed investigators with tips, many well-intentioned, but ultimately fruitless. False leads flooded phone lines. Psychics called with unverifiable visions. Suspects were reported based on vague descriptions. Law enforcement had to balance responding to public pressure with preserving the integrity of their work. As weeks turned into months, interest remained strong. Candlelight vigils were held in Bay Village and neighboring communities. Families taped blue ribbons to their mailboxes, symbolizing hope for Amy's return. A reward fund was established. Volunteers continued distributing flyers and speaking to neighbors, asking if they had seen anything, no matter how insignificant, that might help. After the discovery of Amy's body, media coverage shifted. No longer focused on the hope of recovery, stories turned to the hunt for justice. New outlets followed developments in the investigation, reporting on advancements in forensic science and any updates from law enforcement. Amy's case was regularly featured in television segments dedicated to unsolved crimes. In the following years, several national programs aired detailed episodes on the case. These included crime-focused shows that reconstructed her disappearance, included interviews with family members, investigators, and journalists who had covered the story from the start. The reenactments and updates served a dual purpose, reminding the public that the case was still active and encouraging anyone with dormant memories or suspicions to come forward. The growth of the internet in the late 1990s and early 2000s provided a new platform for engagement. True crime forums and early websites hosted timelines, photos, and discussion boards where amateur sleuths dissected every available detail. Some websites created dedicated pages to Amy's case, compiling every known fact and inviting anonymous tips. These digital spaces allowed for new collaboration between the public and investigators, though they also sometimes spread misinformation. Amy's story also became a staple in the emerging genre of true crime podcasts. These in-depth audio series revisited unsolved crimes, dedicating episodes or entire seasons to specific cases. Her abduction, the known timeline, and the lack of resolution made for compelling narratives. Podcast hosts interviewed surviving detectives, forensic experts, and citizens who recalled the case vividly. These broadcasts brought new audiences into the fold, listeners too young to remember 1989, but eager to contribute or learn. One significant effect of continued media interest was its impact on witnesses and tipsters. Several individuals contacted authorities years after the crime, prompted by seeing Amy's story resurface. In one instance, a former retail worker from the shopping plaza recalled seeing a man watching children closely in the weeks before Amy vanished. Though the information did not lead to an arrest, it helped build the profile of the suspect. Amy's family also played an active role in public engagement. Her mother, Margaret, participated in interviews and made periodic statements, always emphasizing the importance of community support. She became an advocate for missing children, speaking at events and helping raise awareness about child safety. Her grace in the face of tragedy humanized the case and deepened public empathy. Over time, Amy's name became emblematic. Schools included her story in safety programs. Law enforcement used the case in training modules. The plaza where she had last been seen installed security cameras and became a case study in how seemingly safe places could conceal danger. In a broader sense, Amy's case helped catalyze changes in how missing child cases were handled. The early involvement of the FBI, community mobilization, and media partnership set a template later followed in similar tragedies. The lessons learned about timing, public cooperation, and the importance of sustained visibility were carried into future investigations. Even decades later, whenever a new lead emerged or forensic advancement was announced, local news stations returned to the story. Anniversary specials aired on television, and memorials were held at her school. In each instance, the community was reminded of the girl who had once walked to the shopping plaza and never returned. Through media coverage and public persistence, Amy Mihaljevich's case remained one of the most recognized unsolved crimes in America. Her face, voice, and story became part of the collective memory, a tragic symbol, but also a call to remain vigilant and engaged. As the 20th anniversary of Amy Mihaljevich's disappearance approached, investigators took deliberate steps to reignite the case. Though the passage of time had allowed memories to fade and potential evidence to degrade, advances in investigative practices and an enduring public interest created a renewed atmosphere of possibility. The case, while never officially cold, was once again prioritized. In the mid-2000s, Bay Village Police, in partnership with the FBI, restructured their approach. A dedicated team revisited every detail, from Amy's daily routines and phone habits to timelines of other reported luring attempts across Ohio. The goal was to identify patterns missed in earlier reviews and to approach the data with the benefit of modern forensic tools and contemporary behavioral analysis. Among the most critical updates were re-interviews. Detectives returned to individuals who had spoken to investigators in 1989 and 1990, hoping that time had softened reticence or sparked recollection. Some who had once provided general or incomplete information now offered more specifics. A few admitted to having withheld details out of fear or uncertainty at the time. These follow-ups produced several fresh leads, including recollections of suspicious men loitering at the plaza weeks before Amy's disappearance and unusual vehicles seen idling near her school. One such lead identified a man who had allegedly attempted to approach other young girls using a similar story, offering to help buy a gift for a parent. This person had not previously been flagged. He had lived in the region during the late 1980s and had a record of low-level offenses. A background investigation showed that he had relocated multiple times and had changed his name. His prior movements placed him in the general area of both Bay Village and Ashland County. He was interviewed and provided a DNA sample. While not definitively linked to Amy's case, he became one of the most scrutinized persons of interest in years. Another renewed focus was on items missing from the crime scene. Amy's horse-shaped earrings, her denim book bag, and other personal effects were still unaccounted for. Law enforcement made a public appeal, asking anyone who had come into possession of such items under unusual circumstances to come forward. Antique stores, pawn shops, and collectors were contacted. Though no confirmed items were recovered, the appeal served to rekindle awareness. In one promising turn, a former classmate of Amy's contacted police after seeing an anniversary documentary. The classmate recalled a man who had visited the school. During the week, Amy disappeared, claiming to be involved in an educational program. While the memory lacked specific identifying details, it prompted investigators to cross-check visitor logs, substitute teaching records, and volunteer registrations from that period. Though no new suspects were identified from that line of inquiry, it provided further support to the theory that Amy's abductor may have scouted his victim over time. Simultaneously, new interviews were conducted with people living near the field in Ashland County where Amy's body had been discovered. Some longtime residents remembered seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked along the roadside during the fall of 1989. These descriptions, largely centering around a gold or tan-colored sedan, were consistent enough to warrant further investigation. Detectives narrowed down makes and models fitting that profile and reviewed regional vehicle registrations from the time. While no conclusive match was made, the effort added clarity to the possible movements of the suspect. One of the more innovative efforts during this period involved geographic profiling. By analyzing known locations, Amy's home, school, the plaza, and the dump site, specialists generated models to estimate likely areas where the perpetrator may have lived or worked. These models used historical traffic patterns, travel times, and population density to create priority zones for review. Within those zones, investigators focused on individuals with prior criminal records, links to children, or histories of similar behavior. This analysis did not reveal a definitive suspect, but helped refine the ongoing investigative strategy. DNA remained a key focus. Although the evidence collected in 1989 yielded only partial profiles, the possibility of using familial DNA matching grew more viable. Law enforcement continued to monitor developments in public genealogy databases, hoping that a relative of the suspect might eventually surface in a manner similar to recent breakthroughs in other cold cases. Legal restrictions and privacy concerns slowed progress, but the potential remained under active consideration. Throughout this period, public involvement remained vital. Community members in both Bay Village and Ashland County organized memorial events and awareness campaigns. Local schools continued to teach Amy's story as part of safety education, and law enforcement used the case in training for handling child abductions. The continued presence of her name in public discourse sustained a collective commitment to resolution. Despite the passage of 2 decades, the investigation remained vigorous. Each renewed effort revealed new fragments, suggestions, memories, names that enriched the case file. No single lead had yet broken the case open, but investigators believed they were closing in. The profile was clearer, the field of suspects narrower, and the tools at their disposal more powerful than ever before. For the detectives and agents involved, the motivation was personal. Many had children of their own. Some had followed the case since its beginning. For them, the passage of time was not a barrier, but a challenge. They were determined to find the person responsible, regardless of how many years had passed. Amy Mihajlovic's name remained not only in files and archives, but on minds and hearts. Every new lead was a step forward, closer to the truth, closer to justice. More than 3 decades have passed since Amy Mihajlovic was last seen outside the shopping plaza in Bay Village. Time has altered the landscape of the community, replaced buildings, and transformed lives. But within the walls of the Bay Village Police Department and in the files of the FBI, her case remains open, its urgency undiminished by the years. For investigators who have worked the case over the decades, the passage of time has brought both frustration and resolve. Some have retired, others passed the torch to new detectives. Yet a thread of continuity remains: the shared determination to close one of Ohio's most haunting cases. With each new development in forensic science, each shift in public awareness, and each revisit of old interviews, there remains the possibility that the final piece of the puzzle will emerge. Amy's family, forever changed by her loss, have become part of a wider network of families touched by similar tragedies. Her mother, Margaret, became a quiet but enduring advocate for victims' families, always emphasizing the importance of keeping missing persons cases in public view. Her strength became emblematic of the perseverance required to seek answers in a system often slowed by legal, technological, and human limitations. The case has been re-examined by multiple generations of law enforcement. Dozens of persons of interest have been vetted. Thousands of tips cataloged and followed. Every piece of evidence remains preserved, awaiting the technology or moment that will make it meaningful. Several theories persist. Some believe the suspect lived in close proximity to Amy or had indirect access to her through school, community programs, or neighborhood activity. Others suspect a transient figure, someone who passed through the area, perhaps living out of a vehicle or operating in a profession that required travel. Regardless of which scenario is closer to the truth, all investigations continue to revolve around the same core details: the phone call, the lure, the plaza meeting, the rural field. Efforts to generate new leads continue. In recent years, digital outreach has played a larger role. Law enforcement utilizes social media to share reconstructed timelines, sketches, and updates. On anniversaries of the case, Messages circulate across platforms, reminding the public of Amy's face, her story, and the unresolved nature of her murder. Podcasts, documentaries, and televised reports ensure that the case reaches both older residents who remember 1989 and younger generations learning of it for the first time. Law enforcement hopes that someone, somewhere, still remembers something. A passing comment, a suspicious behavior, a connection that once seemed insignificant but now resonates. In tandem, cold case units explore the possibilities of emerging forensic technologies. Genealogical research, advanced DNA extraction, and computational modeling remain active fronts, even as privacy debates complicate the use of familial DNA. Investigators continue to explore every ethical and legal pathway to identify the source of the genetic material collected. Within Bay Village, Amy is not forgotten. A plaque bearing her name stands in the town square. Schools discuss her story not only as a lesson in safety, but as a call for community vigilance. The shopping plaza where she was last seen has changed, but the shadow of what occurred there lingers in memory and purpose. Amy Mihalovich's story has become a cautionary tale, a point of reflection, and a driving force behind policy reforms and safety initiatives. But more than anything, it remains an unfinished chapter in the lives of those who loved her, knew her, or have come to care through the enduring mystery of her disappearance and death. The man who lured her from safety, who manipulated a 10-year-old girl with careful words and pretense, has never been named, but he remains the focus of an enduring investigation, one built on the promise that no matter how much time passes, justice is not a fading ideal. It is a pursuit. Investigators maintain that the case can be solved. They have not lost hope, nor has the community. The file is not closed. The search has not ended. Amy's story is still being written. Chandra Ann Levy was born on April 14, 1977, in Cleveland, Ohio, and raised in Modesto, California. Bright and ambitious, she pursued higher education with enthusiasm, earning a degree in journalism from San Francisco State University. Driven by a keen interest in public affairs and criminal justice, she enrolled in a master's program in public administration at the University of Southern California. As part of her graduate studies, Levy secured a prestigious internship with the Federal Bureau of Prisons in Washington, D.C., a significant step for her future aspirations in law enforcement or public service. Levy arrived in Washington with a clear purpose, working in the Bureau's Public Affairs Office. Her colleagues noted her dedication and competence. She was nearing the end of her internship by spring 2001 and was preparing to return to California for her graduation. She had already packed some belongings and was making plans with her parents, Robert and Susan Levy, about her future. Living alone in a basement apartment in the DuPont Circle neighborhood, Chandra maintained regular contact with her family. Her parents last heard from her on April 30th, 2001. The next day, she stopped responding to messages and calls. Her sudden silence was out of character, prompting concern. When the days passed without any word, her parents reported her missing to the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police on May 6th. The news of her disappearance quickly captured public interest, not just because of her youth and government ties, but also due to the complete lack of clues about what might have happened. A young woman about to start the next chapter of her life had vanished without a trace. On the morning of May 1st, 2001, Chandra Levy accessed her laptop in her Washington, D.C. apartment. Records later revealed she conducted a series of internet searches related to Rock Creek Park, a large urban park near the city. She also viewed maps and information about hiking trails in the park, including directions to the Klingel Mansion area. It was the last confirmed activity linked to her. When Chandra failed to board her scheduled flight to California and missed her graduation ceremony, her parents grew increasingly alarmed. The police were contacted on May 6th, and a missing persons investigation began. Officers who entered her apartment found no signs of forced entry or struggle. Her packed suitcases suggested she had been preparing for her return home. Her cell phone, credit cards, and identification were left behind, but her keys and running shoes were missing. It appeared she had gone for a walk or run, possibly in Rock Creek Park, and never returned. Despite the clues, the initial police response lacked urgency. Chandra was treated as a possible runaway, or someone who had chosen to disappear. Investigators did not immediately follow up on her internet activity or prioritize searches in Rock Creek Park. Her disappearance remained a mystery, gaining media attention but few actionable leads. Over the next weeks, the Levy family made multiple trips to Washington, distributing flyers, speaking to reporters, and pleading for help. With every passing day, concern grew deeper. A promising life had gone dark, and no one could explain why. Following the missing person report filed by Chandra Levy's parents, the Metropolitan Police Department initiated their investigation. Detectives canvassed her neighborhood, questioned neighbors, and reviewed security footage where available. Her apartment showed no sign of forced entry. Investigators recovered her laptop, which became a central focus in the absence of other physical evidence. Analysis of her computer revealed that on the morning of May 1st, she had accessed several websites related to Rock Creek Park. Yet this crucial information was not acted upon immediately. For weeks, investigators failed to organize a coordinated search of the area. The early phase of the investigation was marked by procedural missteps, including a lack of clear direction and an inconsistent approach to leads. Attention turned toward people Chandra knew. Her professional relationships and social life were examined. A particularly sensitive lead emerged involving a congressman from California, Gary Condit, who represented a district near Levy's hometown. Condit initially denied any personal relationship, but under further questioning, admitted to an affair with her. While he was never officially a suspect, the revelation created a wave of media scrutiny that distracted from the broader investigation. Law enforcement faced criticism for their handling of the case, particularly from the Levy family. The investigation was widely viewed as faltering. With no new evidence, no witness sightings, and no suspects, progress stalled. Months passed with little to show. Public confidence waned. For Chandra's family, the waiting continued, defined by frustration and uncertainty. As weeks turned into months with no resolution, media attention around Chandra Levy's disappearance intensified. Interest in the case surged when reports surfaced linking her to Congressman Gary Condit. The revelation of their relationship shifted the public narrative dramatically, placing political scandal at the forefront of national headlines. Condit, a married Democrat with a conservative reputation, initially denied any involvement beyond a professional connection. However, after further investigation, he acknowledged a romantic relationship with Levy. Though he consistently denied any knowledge of her disappearance, the admission fueled widespread speculation. The media fixated on the possibility that the congressman had something to hide. Television networks ran daily updates, newspapers published front-page stories, and talk shows dissected every known detail. The scrutiny extended to the Metropolitan Police Department, with criticism mounting over its focus on Condit while potentially neglecting other investigative paths. The Levy family appeared in interviews, expressing frustration at the lack of progress and the nature of the coverage, which they felt often strayed from the core issue, finding Chandra. Despite being intensely questioned, Condit was never named as a suspect. He cooperated with law enforcement, and his alibi was verified. Still, the controversy damaged his political career. By the time of the 2002 elections, his public image had suffered irreparable harm. The investigation stalled, leads were exhausted, and the case began to grow cold. Yet the intense public interest ensured that Chandra's name remained in the national consciousness, even as solid answers remained elusive. Despite early knowledge of Chandra Levy's online searches about Rock Creek Park, coordinated search efforts in the area were delayed for over a year. The terrain, over 1,700 acres of densely wooded land, presented significant challenges for investigators. Multiple volunteers and law enforcement teams conducted sporadic sweeps of the park in the months following her disappearance. But without a focused plan, these efforts yielded no results. It wasn't until May 22, 2002, that a man walking his dog in a remote area of Rock Creek Park made a discovery. Near a trail that cut through thick vegetation and down an embankment, he came upon skeletal remains partially covered by debris. The area was rugged and difficult to access, far from common footpaths. Investigators quickly arrived at the scene and began a detailed recovery. Alongside the remains, searchers found clothing consistent with what Chandra was believed to have worn on the day she disappeared, including running shoes and leggings. The scene also yielded a sports bra and a Walkman. Dental records confirmed the identity of the remains as Chandra Levy's. The discovery reignited the investigation, but the state of decomposition meant that a cause of death could not be determined. There were no definitive signs of trauma. With no physical evidence indicating the presence of another person at the scene, detectives were left with more questions than answers. The recovery location raised concerns about why this particular section of the park had not been searched more thoroughly earlier. Public and media scrutiny turned once again toward law enforcement practices, questioning the missed opportunities that may have delayed closure for Chandra's family. After the discovery of Chandra Levy's remains in 2002, the investigation struggled to move forward. With no clear cause of death and no forensic evidence pointing to a suspect, the case went cold. Over the next several years, leads dried up and public interest waned. For the Levy family, the lack of resolution was a persistent source of pain. In 2006, a change in leadership within the Metropolitan Police Department brought renewed attention to unresolved cases, including Levy's. A fresh team of detectives was assigned to review the file. As they revisited previous statements and evidence, one name began to stand out: Ingmar Guandique. Guandique, an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador, was serving a prison sentence for attacking two women in Rock Creek Park in the months surrounding Levy's disappearance. Both victims had been jogging alone when they were assaulted near secluded trails. Guandique had no known connection to Levy and initially denied involvement in her case. However, the similarities between his known crimes and the circumstances surrounding Levy's disappearance prompted closer scrutiny. Investigators conducted interviews with Guandique's former cellmates, hoping to uncover any admission or confession. One inmate, Armando Morales, claimed Guandique had confided in him about attacking Levy. Morales alleged that Guandique described grabbing her while she was jogging, though no further details were corroborated. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the investigation took on new momentum. Prosecutors and detectives compiled a case based largely on circumstantial evidence and prison testimony. In March 2009, Guandique was formally charged with Chandra Levy's murder, Ingmar Guandike was officially charged in March 2009 with the murder of Chandra Levy. His arrest came after years of investigative efforts and renewed attention on the case. At the time, Guandike was already incarcerated for separate attacks in Rock Creek Park, involving 2 other female joggers who survived. The similarities between those cases and Chandra's disappearance formed the backbone of the prosecution's argument. Guandike had no direct contact with Levy documented before her death, and no forensic evidence linked him to the crime scene. However, investigators believe the pattern of behavior demonstrated in his previous assaults was compelling. The women had described being approached from behind, thrown to the ground, and assaulted in isolated sections of the park, tactics consistent with what detectives theorized happened to Levy. A key part of the prosecution's case came from the testimony of Armando Morales, a former prison cellmate. Morales claimed Guandike confessed to attacking Levy, admitting that he grabbed her during a robbery attempt. This statement, although uncorroborated, was pivotal in moving the case forward. The arrest reignited national interest in the case. Chandra's parents, who had spent years demanding answers and accountability, expressed cautious optimism. Still, legal experts and observers questioned the strength of the case, noting the absence of physical evidence and the reliance on jailhouse testimony. Guandike maintained his innocence. Through his attorneys, he denied any involvement in Levy's disappearance or death. Nevertheless, with the suspect in custody and a trial on the horizon, prosecutors prepared to take the case before a jury, nearly a decade after Chandra Levy had vanished. The trial of Ingmar Guandike began in October 2010 in Washington, D.C. The prosecution faced the challenge of building a compelling narrative without direct evidence linking Guandike to Chandra Levy's death. They relied heavily on circumstantial elements, including the pattern of Guandike's prior attacks and the jailhouse testimony from Armando Morales. Prosecutors argued that Levy, who had planned a hike in Rock Creek Park on May 1, 2001, was targeted by Guandike while alone on a remote trail. Morales testified that Guandike confessed to assaulting Levy, describing how he approached her from behind, attempted to rob her, and left her in the park. The testimony was presented as a key revelation, even though there was no physical proof or witnesses to the encounter. The defense countered by highlighting the lack of forensic evidence, no eyewitnesses placing Guandike near Levy, and inconsistencies in Morales' statements. They also questioned the credibility of Morales, a convicted felon who had cooperated in exchange for considerations in his own sentencing. Guandike's attorneys emphasized that he had previously denied involvement and had no motive. The trial included emotional testimony from the families of Guandike's other victims, who recounted attacks in similar locations under similar conditions. Although those crimes were not directly linked to Levy's death, prosecutors used the pattern to suggest modus operandi. After weeks of arguments, jury deliberations began. On November 22, 2010, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on 2 counts of first-degree felony murder. The conviction was seen as a long-awaited development in a case that had remained unresolved for nearly a decade. Following the jury's guilty verdict in November 2010, Ingmar Guandike was sentenced in February 2011. The judge imposed a 60-year prison term, citing the serious nature of the crime and the lasting impact on Chandra Levy's family. The sentencing marked the culmination of a long and complex case, which had spanned nearly a decade from Levy's disappearance to the courtroom decision. For Robert and Susan Levy, the verdict brought a measure of closure. They had spent years campaigning for answers, pushing for a resolution that, for a long time, seemed out of reach. In their public statements, they expressed gratitude to law enforcement and prosecutors, while also acknowledging the pain that would never fully subside. Despite the absence of forensic evidence, the court had found the prosecution's case, built largely on circumstantial factors and the testimony of a fellow inmate, sufficient to convict. The result was met with mixed reactions. Some praised the decision as justice finally served, while others raised concerns about the reliability of the key witness and the overall strength of the case. The media, which had followed the story for years, covered the sentencing extensively. Analysts debated whether the verdict was a reflection of solid investigative work or the result of pressure to resolve a high-profile case. Nonetheless, Gwandike was now officially held responsible for Levy's death. In prison, Gwandike was transferred to a federal facility to begin serving his sentence. Though the trial was over, legal questions surrounding the integrity of the conviction lingered, setting the stage for appeals and further scrutiny of the case's foundation. Not long after Ingmar Gwandike's conviction, his legal team began to prepare an appeal. Central to their argument was the credibility of Armando Morales, the jailhouse informant whose testimony had been critical to the prosecution's case. Defense attorneys argued that Morales had received favorable treatment in exchange for his cooperation, and that key aspects of his testimony were inconsistent. Over time, new information began to emerge. The prosecution disclosed previously unrevealed evidence suggesting Morales may have lied on the stand about his past dealings as an informant. Additionally, doubts were raised about whether Morales had fabricated Gwandike's alleged confession to gain personal benefits. In 2013, a D.C. appellate court agreed to hear the case. Defense attorneys emphasized the lack of physical evidence, the absence of eyewitnesses, and the potential miscarriage of justice based on unverified jailhouse statements. The court ordered a review of the conviction, and in 2015, prosecutors conceded that Morales' credibility was significantly compromised. The conviction was formally vacated in 2015. Gwandike, who had already served several years in federal prison, was no longer considered convicted of Chandra Levy's murder. Though not exonerated, he was granted a new trial pending further developments. Prosecutors began preparing for a retrial, but encountered mounting obstacles. Their key witness had been discredited, and no new evidence had emerged to strengthen their case. The Levy family, while supportive of the legal process, expressed frustration and grief over the unraveling of what they had believed was justice served. The prosecution now faced the challenge of whether a new trial could proceed without a reliable foundation. In July 2016, prosecutors made the decision to drop all charges against Ingmar Gwandike. After months of preparation for a retrial and a comprehensive review of available evidence, they concluded that the case could no longer proceed without reasonable prospects for conviction. The withdrawal marked a dramatic reversal in a case that had once seemed resolved. The decision was based in large part on the unreliability of key witness Armando Morales. Investigators had uncovered evidence suggesting that Morales had a history of fabricating jailhouse confessions. His testimony had formed the core of the original prosecution. With his credibility now irreparably damaged, there was no longer a viable case. In a brief court proceeding, prosecutors moved to dismiss the charges. The judge approved the motion, and Gwandike was released from federal custody. At the time, he remained subject to immigration proceedings due to his undocumented status. For Chandra Levy's family, the news was a crushing blow. They had supported the original prosecution and believed that justice had been served. With the dismissal of charges, they were left with the painful reality that the case was once again officially unsolved. In public statements, they expressed profound disappointment and sorrow, renewing their calls for further investigation. Despite the outcome, the Levy case remained a subject of public interest and continued media coverage. Legal experts pointed to the case as an example of the risks involved in relying on jailhouse informants without corroborating evidence. Law enforcement, meanwhile, emphasized their commitment to pursuing any new leads that might arise. The case returned to square one, with no suspects in custody and no definitive answers. In May 2017, Ingmar Guandike was deported to El Salvador following the dismissal of charges related to Chandra Levy's death. After spending years in federal custody, first for the attacks on other women in Rock Creek Park, and later under murder charges that were eventually dropped, Guandike was placed in immigration detention and removed from the United States. He left the country without facing a new trial or legal resolution regarding Levy's case. The deportation marked the end of Guandike's involvement in the U.S. criminal justice system, but it did not bring closure to the Levy investigation. With no active suspects and no additional evidence emerging, the case remained open but inactive. Investigators continued to encourage the public to come forward with any information, but no significant developments followed. The Levy family maintained their advocacy, urging law enforcement to keep the case a priority. They participated in events and campaigns supporting families of missing persons, and continue to speak about the need for systemic improvements in how missing persons investigations are handled. Public and professional assessments of the case often pointed to the early missteps in the investigation, particularly the delayed focus on Rock Creek Park and the initial emphasis on personal relationships. Critics noted how media coverage and political implications may have distracted from crucial leads. Despite the lack of resolution, the Chandra Levy case remained one of the most well-known unsolved crimes in recent U.S. history. For many, it symbolized the complexities and pitfalls of high-profile investigations. For her family, it remained a deeply personal and painful story, one defined by enduring questions and a persistent absence of answers. On the morning of November 19th, 1988, in Hayward, California, 9-year-old Michaela Gerecht and her best friend Katrina Rodriguez planned a short trip to a neighborhood convenience store. It was a Saturday, and like many children, the two girls had the day free. Michaela's mother had allowed her to walk with Katrina to Rainbow Market, located just a few blocks from her home, to buy candy and soda. It was the kind of errand that countless children in suburban neighborhoods ran routinely without incident. The girls arrived at the market shortly after 10 a.m., leaving their scooters outside near the entrance. While they were inside, an unknown man moved Michaela's scooter from where she had parked it to a spot in the parking lot next to his car. It was a deliberate act, later interpreted by investigators as part of a planned abduction. After making their purchases, the girls exited the store. Michaela noticed her scooter had been moved. Without hesitation, she walked toward it to retrieve it. As she reached for the handlebars, a man standing nearby suddenly lunged forward. Witnesses later described the scene in chilling detail. The man grabbed Michaela from behind, wrapping one arm around her waist and lifting her off the ground. Michaela screamed and kicked, trying to break free. Katrina stood in shock, frozen as the man dragged Michaela toward his car, a tan or gold-colored sedan. He opened the front passenger door and forced her inside. Within seconds, he sped away from the parking lot, disappearing onto Mission Boulevard. The abduction happened in broad daylight, in front of multiple witnesses, including several adults. Bystanders rushed to comfort Katrina, who was hysterical and struggling to process what had just happened. Someone quickly called 911. Within minutes, the Hayward Police Department responded and began their preliminary investigation. Officers secured the scene, began taking witness statements, and collected the abandoned scooter. Fingerprints were lifted from the handlebars, one of the few physical pieces of evidence left behind. The abduction of Michaela Garesht shook the local community. Parents were terrified, children suddenly under tighter watch. News of the kidnapping spread rapidly, and law enforcement launched a full-scale investigation within hours. At 9 years old, Michaela became the focus of a case that would stretch over decades, winding through false leads, forensic advances, and long unanswered questions. As the first officers arrived at the Rainbow Market, the urgency of the situation was immediately clear. A young girl had been taken by force in front of her friend and several adult witnesses. The initial scene was chaotic. Neighbors gathered, parents held their children closer, and Katrina Rodriguez, Michaela's friend, sobbed as she tried to recount the moments of the abduction. The Hayward police began collecting descriptions of the suspect and his vehicle. Witnesses described the man as white, in his 20s, with shoulder-length dirty blonde hair and a slender build. The vehicle was identified as a 4-door sedan, possibly an older model in a light gold or tan color. A composite sketch was developed with input from Katrina and others present. This sketch would become one of the most widely circulated images in the country over the following weeks. Police officers quickly sealed off the market's parking lot and collected physical evidence, focusing on the scooter Michaela had tried to retrieve. The scooter's handlebars bore fingerprints that were preserved and sent for analysis, though at the time, they did not match any entries in existing databases. That afternoon, local news stations began reporting the story. Michaela's name and photograph were broadcast across the Bay Area. Her mother, Sharon Murch, appeared on camera pleading for her daughter's safe return. A press conference was held by the Hayward Police Department, where they announced that Michaela's disappearance was being treated as a kidnapping. Within 24 hours, the FBI joined the investigation, lending additional resources and expertise. Flyers bearing Michaela's photo and the suspect's composite sketch were distributed across California and eventually nationwide. Law enforcement hoped that the exposure would bring new leads or jog someone's memory. The national attention grew quickly. Celebrities joined in the appeals. Joe Montana, quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers, appeared in a televised spot urging anyone with information to come forward. The community in Hayward organized volunteer search parties and posted flyers in windows, on telephone poles, and across surrounding towns. Leads began to pour in, hundreds in the first week alone. Each one had to be evaluated and followed, stretching the resources of the police. False sightings, mistaken identities, and even hoaxes complicated the already emotional investigation. Yet, investigators remained determined, moving quickly in the crucial first hours and days when the chance of recovering an abducted child is highest. Despite the effort, Michaela's trail quickly went cold. The suspect's car had vanished, leaving no license plate number. The composite sketch generated thousands of tips, but none led to a credible suspect. The fingerprint on the scooter, while preserved, could not be matched to any known individual at the time. Michaela's disappearance remained the top priority for the Hayward Police Department and a key case for the FBI's child abduction team. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, frustration mounted. The case that had begun with such urgency entered a long, uncertain stage, one marked by persistence, but increasingly fewer answers. In the weeks following Michaela Garesht's abduction, Hayward transformed. What had once been a quiet East Bay suburb became the center of a growing regional and national campaign to bring Michaela home. Her disappearance had ignited a wave of compassion, concern, and urgency that drew people together from all walks of life. Local residents organized daily search efforts. Volunteers combed through parks, fields, creeks, and vacant lots, hoping to find a clue. Any item of clothing, a footprint, a discarded object that might point to Michaela's whereabouts. Community members who had never met Michaela or her family spent their weekends and evenings walking shoulder to shoulder with law enforcement and family friends. Search grids were mapped, flyers were distributed at gas stations and shopping centers, and command posts were established to coordinate the ongoing search. At the heart of the movement was Michaela's mother, Sharon. Her calm but determined presence became a symbol of strength. She worked closely with the police while maintaining a public voice, urging the abductor to let her daughter go, speaking directly to Michaela in televised messages, and thanking the community for their continued support. Her words, sometimes broadcast from the steps of the Hayward Police Department, carried the emotional weight of a mother who refused to give up. The community organized candlelight vigils and prayer circles. Churches and local organizations held meetings, and donation boxes appeared throughout the area to support the family and search efforts. Volunteers helped run a tip line and maintained a central location for information sharing. Children's photos and age-progressed illustrations appeared on milk cartons and bulletin boards, increasing public awareness. National media kept the case in the public eye. Television segments revisited the circumstances of the abduction, recapped Michaela's last known moments, and broadcast updated sketches of the suspect. The image of Michaela, with her bright eyes and dimpled smile, became one of the most recognized faces among missing children. Despite the constant flow of information, no viable leads emerged that could locate Michaela. Authorities received tips from as far away as Nevada and Southern California, but none yielded concrete results. Psychics called in with visions. Prank calls added emotional strain. Every clue was investigated, but the case remained unresolved. By the end of 1988, thousands of man-hours had been spent on the case. Posters began to fade in the weather, but community resolve did not. The Gerecht family continued their public advocacy, pushing for greater awareness of missing children and calling on lawmakers to strengthen abduction response protocols. What began as a response to a singular tragedy evolved into a broader movement, one that sought not only to bring Michaela home, but also to protect others from facing the same fate. The community's efforts would continue into the new year, fueled by a commitment to justice and a refusal to forget. Michaela's name became a call to action, a reminder of a child still out there, and of a community unwilling to give up. In the months following Michaela's abduction, the Hayward Police Department and the FBI were flooded with leads. Every day brought new tips, some credible, others clearly fabricated or mistaken. Investigators sifted through each one, hoping to find a thread that would lead to Michaela. The case files grew by the week, and with them, a list of potential suspects. Among the first individuals scrutinized was a man named Tim Bindner. He was known to law enforcement due to his unusual behavior around missing children cases. He had sent letters to several families of abducted girls and seemed to insert himself into investigations. In the Gerecht case, Bindner's name surfaced when he made contact with the family. Though he never claimed involvement, his interest in multiple cases drew concern. Police executed a search warrant on Bindner's home. Inside, they found newspaper clippings about Michaela and other missing girls, as well as maps and notes detailing locations around the Bay Area. Despite the circumstantial nature of the findings, investigators could not establish a definitive link between Bindner and Michaela's disappearance. There was no physical evidence tying him to the scene. Bittner denied any wrongdoing and maintained that he was simply concerned for the children. While Bittner remained a person of interest for a time, attention also turned to other leads. Several men were detained or questioned after being reported for suspicious behavior, particularly if they matched the composite sketch. Some of these individuals had criminal records, but none could be connected to the case. Tips came from across the country. A girl matching Michaela's description was reportedly seen in a fast food restaurant in Reno. Another report placed her in a mall in Southern California. Both sightings were investigated and ruled out. False leads became a constant obstacle. The media attention that had initially helped bring awareness also attracted a wave of hoaxes. Some individuals called with confessions that turned out to be fabrications. Others tried to insert themselves into the narrative, claiming to be witnesses or intermediaries. These diversions drained time and resources, forcing investigators to double back and verify every detail. Still, law enforcement continued their efforts. The sketch was re-released periodically. Age-progressed images of Michaela were developed as time passed. Law enforcement agencies coordinated with missing children, organizations, and reviewed similar cases for patterns. Though each new tip offered a glimmer of hope, the trail consistently ended in disappointment. The early years of the investigation were marked by intense effort, but also growing frustration. There was a strong belief that the case could be solved, yet the critical breakthrough remained elusive. In the absence of clear forensic evidence or a credible witness beyond Michaela's friend, investigators faced a narrowing path forward. By the early 1990s, while Michaela's case remained open and active, it had entered a colder phase. Detectives still reviewed new tips, and her family continued to advocate publicly. But the leads that once came daily began to slow. The hope that the abduction might be quickly resolved gave way to a long-term commitment, one grounded in persistence rather than expectation. More than a decade after Michaela Garecht's disappearance, a new lead emerged from a dark corner of California's criminal history. The so-called speed freak killers, Wesley Shermantine and Lauren Herzog, had been linked to a series of gruesome murders spanning the Central Valley. As investigators delved into their activities, some began to suspect that their list of victims might include Michaela. The connection began to take shape in the late 1990s and gained momentum in the early 2000s. Shermantine and Herzog had been arrested and convicted in relation to multiple killings. Shermantine was sentenced to death, while Herzog received a prison term. Years later, following Herzog's parole and subsequent suicide in 2012, Shermantine began communicating with authorities, offering to reveal locations of additional burial sites in exchange for benefits. Shermantine's information led to the discovery of human remains buried in remote areas of San Joaquin and Calaveras counties. Among the recovered bones were several unidentified victims. This development sparked speculation about unresolved disappearances across the region, including that of Michaela Garecht. The age and gender of some remains, combined with the killer's operational areas, seemed to loosely align with her case. Forensic teams began the difficult process of analyzing the remains. DNA testing was used to compare them against known samples from missing persons. Michaela's family provided their own DNA, hoping for answers. As the analyses proceeded, officials examined whether any aspects of Michaela's case, such as her age, physical description, or abduction method, matched the known patterns of the speed freak killers. Initial hope faded as the results came in. One by one, the remains were identified as victims unrelated to Michaela's disappearance. The fragmentary condition of the bones made definitive identification slow. and many samples did not yield viable DNA. However, the most promising lead, a bone fragment initially thought to possibly belong to Michaela, was conclusively ruled out after testing. Despite the exclusion, the investigation into the speed freak killers did reinforce one fact. California had more than one predator operating in the late 1980s and early 1990s. It also highlighted how many missing persons cases remained unresolved, waiting for the right technological or informational breakthrough. For Michaela's family, the episode reopened emotional wounds, but also brought renewed attention to her case. The media coverage of the speed freak killers prompted fresh public interest. It led to more tips and a temporary increase in public involvement. Yet again, investigators found themselves chasing possibilities that ultimately led back to the same place. A lack of evidence definitively pointing to what happened to Michaela after that morning at the Rainbow Market. As the focus moved away from Shermantine and Herzog, law enforcement continued to monitor any related developments. The hope remained that even the most tangential investigation might someday connect to the answers they had long sought. In August 2009, the dramatic rescue of J.C. Lee Dugard, 18 years after her abduction, shocked the nation and reawakened long-dormant hope for families of other missing children. Dugard had been kidnapped in South Lake Tahoe in 1991 and held in captivity by Philip and Nancy Garrido at their Antioch home, just over an hour from Hayward. The discovery of Dugard alive prompted immediate reevaluation of unsolved child abductions throughout Northern California, including that of Michaela Gerecht. Philip Garrido, a convicted sex offender, had lived in the region at the time of Michaela's disappearance. His criminal profile, history of kidnapping, and access to secluded property led law enforcement to consider him a potential suspect. The similarities between the Michaela and J.C. cases were compelling. Both girls had been taken in daylight from public places, both were young blonde girls, and both abductions had occurred within several years and counties of each other. Investigators began a detailed review of the Garridos' whereabouts around November 1988. Records were analyzed and timelines reconstructed. Law enforcement examined evidence from the Antioch property, which included outbuildings and tents where J.C. had been held. Items were seized and cataloged. Forensic teams searched for any trace evidence that could link Michaela to the site. At the same time, Michaela's family braced for the possibility that she might still be alive, hidden away as J.C. had been. Sharon Murch, her mother, acknowledged the renewed attention, but remained cautious. The emotional impact of seeing another child reunited with her family after so many years brought both comfort and renewed grief. Despite the intense scrutiny, no evidence was found connecting Michaela to the Garridos. Neither J.C. Dugard nor the Garridos offered any information about Michaela, and nothing recovered from the property suggested she had ever been there. Investigators concluded there was no direct link. The case once again returned to a state of uncertainty. Nevertheless, the investigation underscored the importance of re-examining cold cases with each new development. The Dugard case revealed systemic failures and gaps in law enforcement communication that could have been addressed sooner. Michaela's case, among others, benefited from the resulting reforms in how missing child reports were managed and followed. The Garrido lead, although ultimately unproductive in Michaela's case, represented a critical moment in the ongoing effort. It reminded investigators and the public alike that even long-dormant cases could yield answers, and that those responsible for long, cold crimes sometimes lived not far from the scenes they had haunted. For Michaela's family, the episode left them once again suspended between hope and sorrow, but it also reinforced their commitment to keeping her story alive in case the next breakthrough might finally bring her home. As years passed and traditional investigative avenues yielded little progress, advances in forensic science began to offer new hope in long unsolved cases like Michaela Gerecht's. One of the most significant developments was the refinement of fingerprint analysis and the expansion of national databases. This shift transformed how cold cases were reviewed, including the possibility of re-evaluating evidence collected decades earlier. In Michaela's case, a critical piece of evidence had always been the scooter left at the scene of her abduction. From the beginning, investigators had lifted fingerprints from its handlebars. Despite their efforts, these prints had never matched any known individual in law enforcement databases. For years, they remained a silent witness, preserved but anonymous. By the mid-2010s, as fingerprint analysis technology became more sensitive and databases more comprehensive, law enforcement began reprocessing old physical evidence using updated systems. Latent prints could now be digitized, enhanced, and cross-referenced with millions of entries, including prints added through new arrests and convictions nationwide. The Hayward Police Department, along with federal authorities, re-examined the fingerprints from Michaela's scooter using this modern technology. Analysts revisited the physical print cards, scanning and comparing them using updated algorithms. It was a methodical process requiring patience and precision. Over the years, law enforcement had preserved not only the prints, but the documentation surrounding their recovery, ensuring they could be reanalyzed without contamination. Meanwhile, other evidence from the case was also subjected to advanced testing. Items from the original investigation were retested for DNA, though results remained inconclusive. Forensic techniques had improved, but much of the material was degraded or limited. Still, the fingerprint analysis became the central focus due to its quality and potential matchability. As this new round of analysis progressed, law enforcement quietly expanded their scope. They looked at individuals who had been convicted of violent crimes since 1988, checking for any overlap with Michaela's case. The aim was to find someone whose fingerprints, not previously available, had since entered national databases due to a later conviction. Eventually, this effort produced a result. A match was identified between one of the latent fingerprints from Michaela's scooter and an individual whose prints had been recently submitted, following a separate investigation. After decades, the anonymous fingerprint now had a name. The identification was rechecked, verified, and confirmed by independent experts. This breakthrough would lead to a stunning development, altering the course of the case. It provided the first direct forensic link to Michaela's abduction, a name investigators had never previously considered. More than 3 decades after the crime, the fingerprint on her scooter would open the door to long-awaited answers. On December 21st, 2020, more than 32 years after Michaela Gerecht vanished, the Alameda County District Attorney's Office announced that David Misch had been charged with her abduction and murder. The long silent fingerprint found on Michaela's scooter had finally spoken. It matched Misch, a convicted killer serving time for a 1989 murder in nearby Fremont. The identification stunned the public and offered a long-awaited development in one of California's most haunting unsolved cases. Misch's name had never surfaced during the initial investigation, nor had he been connected to Michaela in any way until the forensic match was made. Investigators now had physical evidence placing him at the scene of her abduction, a fact made all the more chilling by his criminal history. David Misch had a long record of violence. At the time of Michaela's disappearance in 1988, he was living in the East Bay. Just months later, in 1989, he was arrested and ultimately convicted of murdering a woman in her home. That conviction had landed him in state prison, where he remained as new forensic tools brought his name to light. With the fingerprint match as the foundation, authorities reconstructed the timeline of Mish's movements in 1988. They confirmed that he lived within driving distance of Rainbow Market and that his car, an older light-colored sedan, resembled the vehicle described by witnesses. Although no direct eyewitness had identified him at the time, the new forensic link reshaped the case narrative. In announcing the charges, officials stated that Michaela was believed to have been murdered shortly after her abduction. The precise details of her fate remained unknown, and her remains had not been recovered. Still, the evidence was sufficient to charge Mish with kidnapping and murder under special circumstances, allowing prosecutors to seek the harshest penalties. Mish had previously been linked to 2 other cold case homicides from 1986, involving the double murder of 2 women in Fremont. His known behavior pattern, proximity to Michaela's abduction site, and forensic connection created a compelling argument for his prosecution. He declined to speak with investigators following his new charges. For Michaela's family, the announcement brought both relief and renewed grief. Sharon Murch issued a statement acknowledging the complex emotions of learning that her daughter had likely been killed so long ago. The clarity brought by the arrest did not ease the pain of loss, but it did provide a long-sought answer to one of the most painful questions: who took Michaela? Law enforcement credited advancements in forensic science and the persistence of cold case investigators for the breakthrough. They emphasized the importance of maintaining and rechecking evidence, no matter how much time had passed. The arrest marked a major turning point in the case, a point at which justice, long deferred, might finally be pursued. Following the announcement of charges against David Mish, the case of Michaela Garecht returned to the spotlight. The criminal proceedings began to take shape with a formal arraignment. Mish, already incarcerated, was transferred to Alameda County to face the new charges. In court, he appeared without speaking, represented by a public defender. He entered no plea initially, and a preliminary hearing was scheduled to determine if the case would proceed to trial. Prosecutors presented their central evidence, the fingerprint on Michaela's scooter, and outlined a circumstantial case built around Mish's known behavior, timeline, and lack of an alibi. Though decades had passed, the fingerprint provided a rare piece of physical evidence directly tying him to the scene of the crime. Authorities also highlighted similarities between Michaela's case and other crimes linked to Mish, including sudden, violent attacks on women. The legal strategy was clear: establish a pattern of predatory violence and use the fingerprint to place Mish at the scene during the critical window of Michaela's disappearance. While the passage of time made it difficult to build a fully detailed narrative, the prosecution argued that the fingerprint alone, on an item touched by both the victim and her abductor, was sufficient to proceed. The defense, meanwhile, signaled its intent to challenge the reliability of the fingerprint evidence. They raised questions about chain of custody, degradation over time, and potential for error in database matching. They also noted the absence of eyewitnesses or recovered remains, asserting that the prosecution's case lacked a complete narrative of what happened to Michaela after the abduction. Public reaction was intense. Many who had grown up with Michaela's case felt the arrest was long overdue. Vigils were held in Hayward, and the Rainbow Market, still standing, became a site of remembrance. Community members left flowers and photos, some of them faded from earlier anniversaries but carefully preserved. The announcement also prompted renewed calls for justice in other cold cases, with families of missing children expressing both solidarity and cautious optimism. Michaela's family, while appreciative of the breakthrough, continued to advocate for the full story to be uncovered. Sharon Murch emphasized the need to understand not only who was responsible, but what had happened to her daughter. Without a body, there remained unanswered questions, questions that continued to weigh heavily on everyone involved. Media outlets revisited the decades-long investigation, creating detailed retrospectives that traced the evolution of the case from the 1980s to the present. Experts weighed in on forensic methods, cold case strategies, and the broader implications of such delayed justice. The story served as a sobering reminder of the importance of persistence in unresolved cases and the critical role of evolving forensic science. As the legal proceedings continued, the community watched closely. A trial, if it occurred, promised to re-examine one of the Bay Area's most haunting crimes in full detail. For now, the case had moved from uncertainty to accountability, with one man finally facing justice for a crime that had once seemed unsolvable. More than 3 decades after Michaela Garecht was taken from a store parking lot, the case reached a moment of clarity, but not closure. With David Misch charged, the legal system now carried the responsibility of determining guilt. Yet for Michaela's family, and for the investigators who had spent years seeking answers, the pursuit of justice remained an evolving journey. The prosecution's case continued to take shape as they prepared for trial. Though no date was immediately set, pretrial motions focused on evidence admissibility and expert testimony. The district attorney's office reaffirmed its intent to pursue the charges to the fullest extent possible. Despite the challenges posed by time, missing physical remains, and fading memories, the case was positioned as a test of forensic advancement and investigative perseverance. Meanwhile, the community that had supported Michaela's family for decades remained engaged. Advocacy groups used the case to spotlight the importance of preserving evidence in missing children investigations. National databases for DNA, fingerprints, and missing persons were increasingly viewed as essential tools, not only for new cases, but for re-examining those long considered unsolvable. Michaela's name became synonymous with a generation of missing children who never made it home. Her story, once just a tragic headline, grew into a symbol of determination and the refusal to forget. Over the years, her family worked to ensure that her legacy would include more than just her loss. Through interviews, public writing, and engagement with missing persons networks, Michaela's mother gave voice to families navigating the same painful uncertainty. Despite the arrest, key questions remained. The exact circumstances of Michaela's final moments were still unknown. Where she had been taken, how she had died, and where her remains might be found, those answers remained elusive. Officials continued to ask for public assistance, hoping that someone, somewhere, might hold a piece of the puzzle that could complete the narrative. The arrest of David Misch marked a critical step forward, but investigators acknowledged that their work was not over. The case remained open, its final resolution still dependent on the legal system and any additional information that might emerge. Prosecutors hoped that further examination might produce new evidence or compel cooperation from individuals connected to Misch's past. For Michaela's family, the decades-long ordeal was marked by resilience. Their commitment to truth never wavered, even when leads dried up or public attention faded. In Michaela's name, they continued to advocate for children, for reforms in investigative practices, and for greater accountability in law enforcement responses to abductions. As the legal process moved ahead, Michaela's story was no longer one of mystery alone. It had become one of justice pursued, of technology catching up with history, and of the enduring will to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Christina Mae Thomas, known as Tina, was born on February 13, 1977, in West Germany. Adopted by Tommy and Cindy Thomas, she grew up in the United States, eventually settling in Alabama. Tina pursued higher education at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where she met David Gabriel "Gabe" Watson in January 2001. Their relationship progressed, leading to their engagement and subsequent marriage on October 11, 2003. Gabe Watson was an experienced diver, having completed his rescue diving course in 2001. Tina, on the other hand, had limited diving experience. She began diving lessons in January 2003 and earned her certification shortly before their wedding. For their honeymoon, the couple planned a scuba diving trip to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. They departed the United States on October 13, 2003, arriving in Sydney on October 17th. After spending a few days sightseeing, they traveled to Townsville, Queensland on October 21st, where they boarded the dive vessel Spoil Sport, operated by Mike Ball Dive Expeditions. PT Limited. The Spoil Sport set sail that evening, heading towards the historic shipwreck site of the SS Yongala, located approximately 48 nautical miles southeast of Townsville. The Yongala, a passenger ship that sank in 1911, rests at a depth of around 30 meters and is known for its strong currents, making it a challenging dive site even for experienced divers. On the morning of October 22, 2003, after a briefing by the dive staff, Tina and Gabe prepared for their first dive at the Yongala wreck. They entered the water around 10:30 a.m., accompanied by other divers. This dive marked Tina's first experience diving in open ocean conditions and at such depths. Tragically, during this dive, Tina lost consciousness and sank to the ocean floor. Despite efforts by other divers and crew members to resuscitate her, she was pronounced dead. The circumstances surrounding her death would soon become the subject of intense scrutiny and legal proceedings in both Australia and the United States. October 22, 2003, dawned clear and calm as the dive vessel Spoilsport reached the site of the SS Yongala wreck. The site, renowned for its marine life and strong underwater currents, posed inherent challenges even for seasoned divers. Dive briefings emphasized the need for caution, particularly for less experienced individuals. Tina Watson, newly certified and with minimal log dives, prepared with her husband, Gabe, for what was to be the highlight of their honeymoon. The couple entered the water mid-morning with a group of other divers. Witnesses later described the conditions as manageable, but noted a noticeable current. As the group descended, they made their way toward the wreck, approximately 30 meters below the surface. Tina and Gabe, who had previously dived together during training, proceeded more slowly than the others. Accounts from fellow divers and dive supervisors would later differ significantly from Gabe's version of events. According to Gabe, Tina signaled she was having trouble. He claimed she was panicking, and after attempting to assist her by inflating her buoyancy control device and guiding her toward the ascent line, he saw her eyes widen before she sank abruptly. He said he attempted to reach her, but was forced to surface due to his own distress and exertion. However, other divers reported seeing Gabe swimming away from Tina as she descended motionless toward the wreck. One diver, Dr. Stanley Stutz, saw Tina on the seabed, lying on her back, her arms outstretched. Another diver, Wade Singleton, a crew member from the vessel, was alerted by nearby divers and descended quickly to bring her body to the surface. Rescue efforts began immediately. Tina was brought aboard Spoilsport, where CPR was administered for approximately 45 minutes. Despite these efforts, she was pronounced dead on deck, Her body was transferred to authorities upon arrival back on shore. The dive community on the vessel was shaken. Questions emerged almost immediately. Tina's limited experience contrasted sharply with the difficulty of the dive site. Gabe's actions, surfacing without his wife, remaining detached from the rescue, and inconsistent retellings, drew quiet concern and growing suspicion. Dive professionals began to document their observations for the authorities. As the vessel returned to Townsville, the tragic dive was no longer seen as an unfortunate accident. What had begun as a honeymoon trip now hovered under a dark cloud of unanswered questions, setting the stage for an international investigation. Upon returning to Townsville, the SpoilSport crew handed Tina Watson's body over to Australian authorities. Local police began their standard protocol for a non-natural death at sea. The initial incident report was brief, but within hours, discrepancies in witness accounts prompted deeper scrutiny. Gabe Watson, visibly distressed but composed, was interviewed shortly after disembarkation. He repeated his earlier account. Tina had panicked, he tried to assist, and she slipped away before he could save her. However, dive supervisor Wade Singleton's report conflicted with Gabe's narrative. Singleton described seeing Gabe already back at the dive line while Tina was still descending, motionless. Other divers recalled that Gabe did not immediately call for help, nor did he assist in the recovery or resuscitation efforts. The local coroner ordered an autopsy, and Tina's body was sent to Brisbane for examination. Early findings showed no evidence of trauma or marine animal involvement. Her equipment was tested. It was found to be in working condition, including her buoyancy control device. Investigators noted Gabe had not mentioned switching off Tina's air supply pre-dive, a detail he later acknowledged, claiming he'd done it to conserve air during their descent. As inquiries deepened, Gabe remained in Australia for several days before returning to the United States. He was not under arrest, and authorities allowed his departure, though questions remained. The coroner's office continued gathering statements, analyzing dive computer data, and coordinating with the Queensland Police Service. Tina's family, upon receiving the news, were devastated. Communication between the Thomas family and Gabe became strained. While arrangements were made for Tina's body to be returned home, her father voiced concerns about the circumstances of her death. The lack of clear answers and inconsistencies in Gabe's story intensified their unease. Australian media began to cover the story, and as public attention grew, so did pressure on investigators to determine whether Tina's death was an accident or something more sinister. The tone of the inquiry shifted. What began as a tragic diving mishap was now being viewed through the lens of potential criminal liability. The early days following Tina Watson's death laid the groundwork for a protracted legal saga. Law enforcement officials collected dive logs, computer records, and witness statements, attempting to piece together the final moments of Tina's life on the seafloor. Suspicion was growing, and the case was moving beyond a maritime accident into the realm of forensic and criminal investigation. As investigators reviewed the data and statements, inconsistencies in Gabe Watson's version of events grew increasingly apparent. His description of Tina's distress and his efforts to assist her did not align with witness testimonies, dive computer records, or physical evidence. Gabe claimed Tina began to panic shortly after descending, signaling that she wanted to return to the surface. He said he attempted to help her, inflating her buoyancy control device and trying to lead her to the ascent line, but that she knocked his mask off and regulator out of his mouth, causing him to lose control. According to Gabe, when he recovered, Tina was sinking beyond his reach. However, the dive computers painted a different picture. The data revealed that Gabe had a relatively slow descent, followed by a brief bottom time and an unusually rapid ascent. Tina's computer showed a brief descent before it flatlined, consistent with her sinking to the seafloor. There was no recorded attempt at ascent, contradicting Gabe's assertion that she had tried to surface. Other divers challenged Gabe's narrative. Several noted that he was seen swimming away from Tina rather than toward her. No one observed a struggle or emergency rescue attempt. His composure after resurfacing, and his failure to immediately call for help, puzzled experienced divers and crew. Adding to suspicions, a dive instructor aboard the Spoil Sport noted that Tina had expressed nervousness about the dive during the pre-dive briefing. She had not been paired with an instructor or dive buddy apart from her husband, despite her limited experience. Gabe, trained as a rescue diver, was considered capable of supporting her. The assumption was that he would provide guidance and ensure her safety. Further contradictions emerged when Gabe later altered details of his account. In one version, Tina knocked his mask off. In another, he claimed she sank too quickly for him to react. He failed to explain why he did not make a controlled emergency descent to retrieve her, or why he did not remove her weights to aid flotation. Meanwhile, Tina's family grew increasingly alarmed by the gaps and shifting explanations. They shared concerns with both Australian and American authorities. The behavior of Gabe in the days following the incident, particularly his lack of engagement in the recovery and funeral arrangements, deepened their doubts. By early 2004, the inconsistencies had transformed the investigation. No longer seen as a diver overwhelmed by tragedy, Gabe Watson was being viewed as a potential suspect. The growing body of conflicting evidence laid the foundation for what would become a multinational legal battle centered on truth, accountability, and justice for Tina Watson. By mid-2004, the Queensland Police Service had gathered a comprehensive file on Tina Watson's death. Statements from witnesses, dive instructors, and experts were compiled. Dive computer data, autopsy results, and equipment testing all contributed to a growing body of evidence. The Office of the State Coroner took lead on the case, initiating a formal inquest to determine whether Tina's death could be classified as accidental, negligent, or criminal. Forensic pathologists reported no natural disease or traumatic injury that could explain sudden unconsciousness. Tina's air supply was intact and her buoyancy device functional. Tests showed no signs of embolism or other diving-related medical emergencies. The autopsy confirmed drowning as the cause of death, but it did not explain how or why she ended up unconscious on the ocean floor. Dive experts were called to interpret the dive data and behavior. Many questioned Gabe's decision-making, his choice to take Tina to a deep, high-current site on her first major dive, his failure to remove her weight belt, and his delayed response after she lost consciousness. These choices were considered inconsistent with his training as a rescue diver. The inquest scrutinized the underwater events, but also examined behavior before and after Tina's death. Gabe's insurance policies came under review. Investigators learned that a life insurance policy listing Gabe as the beneficiary had been altered shortly before the trip, although it was not in force at the time of Tina's death. Gabe's financial motivation was questioned, but ultimately found inconclusive. However, the pattern of minimizing engagement in Tina's funeral planning and post-incident communication fueled suspicion. Witnesses described Tina as cheerful but cautious. Some recalled that she was apprehensive about diving the Yongala wreck, expressing fear about the dive's difficulty. Gabe, in contrast, had insisted on the dive plan. His control over the logistics and decision-making became a focal point. In June 2005, Queensland's deputy state coroner announced a formal inquest would be held. It convened in Brisbane in 2007. Over several weeks, the court heard from more than 50 witnesses. Dive professionals testified about standard rescue procedures that were not followed. One expert noted that Gabe's version of events was inconsistent with how a trained diver would typically react during a buddy emergency. The coroner's report, delivered in 2008, concluded there was sufficient evidence to charge Gabe Watson with manslaughter. The recommendation was forwarded to the Director of Public Prosecutions in Queensland. In November of that year, the DPP formally charged Gabe with manslaughter by gross negligence. A warrant for his arrest was issued. Negotiations began between Australian authorities and Gabe's legal team. He was still in the United States, and the extradition process was complex. Months of legal wrangling followed. Gabe ultimately agreed to return to Australia voluntarily to face the charge, arriving in Brisbane in May 2009. Upon arrival, he was arrested and remanded to custody. The investigation had moved from suspicion to formal accusation. What began as a mysterious diving death had now led to an international criminal case, with legal proceedings set to determine whether negligence or intent lay beneath the waves where Tina Watson drowned. When Gabe Watson returned to Australia in May 2009, he was taken into custody immediately upon landing in Brisbane. Under the terms negotiated in advance, he had agreed to face charges in Queensland but had not entered a plea. Public interest in the case surged. Media outlets followed his every move as courtroom proceedings unfolded in the Brisbane Magistrates Court. Watson was formally charged with the manslaughter of his wife, Tina Watson, based on allegations of criminal negligence. The prosecution argued that, as a certified rescue diver, he had failed to fulfill his duty of care during the fatal dive. Key points included his failure to attempt a proper rescue, his abandonment of Tina during the descent, and his neglect in removing her weight belt or inflating her buoyancy vest when she showed signs of distress. The defense maintained that Tina had panicked underwater, and that Gabe did what he could to save her, but was unable to reach her in time. They emphasized that the currents were strong, and that his own regulator had been dislodged during the attempt to assist her. Faced with the prospect of a full trial and a possible sentence of up to 15 years if convicted, Gabe's legal team entered negotiations with the prosecution. In June 2009, a plea deal was reached. Gabe agreed to plead guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter, specifically admitting that he had failed to fulfill his duty to rescue Tina when she was in distress. On June 5, 2009, Gabe Watson stood before the Queensland Supreme Court and entered his plea. The judge accepted the guilty plea, acknowledging that while Gabe's conduct had not met the standard expected of a rescue-certified diver, the case lacked evidence of intentional harm. The focus remained on gross negligence rather than premeditated action. The sentencing hearing occurred the same day. The prosecution outlined the circumstances surrounding Tina's death and Gabe's failures. The defense argued that Gabe was overwhelmed, inexperienced with high-pressure emergency situations despite his certification, and devastated by the loss. Justice Peter Lyons sentenced Gabe Watson to 4.5 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 12 months. The sentence drew sharp criticism, particularly from Tina's family and the public. Many viewed it as lenient, especially considering the international attention and perceived gravity of the case. Gabe was transferred to a Brisbane correctional facility, where he began serving his sentence. In November 2010, after serving 18 months, he was released on parole and deported back to the United States. However, his legal challenges were not over. Even as he left Australia, U.S. authorities signaled their intention to pursue charges under Alabama state law. The Australian proceedings had concluded with a conviction, but not closure. Tina's family remained dissatisfied with the outcome, and prosecutors in Alabama believed there was still a case to answer. The legal saga, it seemed, was far from finished. Following Gabe Watson's deportation from Australia in 2010, authorities in Alabama began to build a case for murder. The Alabama Attorney General's office believed Gabe's conduct before, during, and after the fatal dive revealed intent, not just negligence. With mounting pressure from Tina's family and public scrutiny, state prosecutors explored whether a stronger charge could be justified under U.S. law. In October 2010, a Jefferson County grand jury indicted Gabe Watson on charges of capital murder. The indictment alleged two theories. One, that Gabe had killed Tina for pecuniary gain, referencing the life insurance policy naming him as a beneficiary, and two, that the murder occurred during a kidnapping based on the claim that he had lured her to Australia under false pretenses. Under Alabama law, either theory could qualify for capital punishment. Gabe was arrested shortly after his return to the United States and held in a county jail in Birmingham, Alabama, without bond. His defense team criticized the charges as politically motivated, citing the timing of the indictment and the upcoming election for Attorney General. They argued that the same incident had already been prosecuted in Australia, resulting in a conviction and prison sentence, and that a second prosecution violated principles of fairness. The prosecution countered that the manslaughter plea in Australia addressed negligent behavior, not intentional murder. They emphasized Gabe's unusual behavior after Tina's death, including his failure to participate in her funeral arrangements, the handling of her estate, and his attempts to collect on various policies. As the case moved toward trial, legal questions emerged about jurisdiction and the applicability of double jeopardy protections. Gabe's attorneys filed motions to dismiss, claiming that he had already been tried and punished for the same act in another country. The state maintained that U.S. constitutional protections against double jeopardy did not apply to foreign convictions, and that Alabama had the right to prosecute its own charges independently. The case drew national media attention. News outlets revisited the dive, the investigations, and the contrasting legal proceedings across two countries. Public opinion was divided. Some viewed Gabe Watson as a manipulative killer who had escaped full accountability. Others saw the second prosecution as an overreach, possibly unconstitutional. Pre-trial hearings were contentious. The defense demanded the exclusion of evidence already scrutinized in Australia. The prosecution insisted on bringing new expert witnesses to argue that the dive was a setup, orchestrated to appear accidental, but carried out with calculated timings and intent. As trial preparations continued into early 2012, the legal and procedural complexities escalated. It became clear that the Alabama court would be forced to rule on issues with potentially far-reaching constitutional implications. The case was no longer just about one death in the waters off Australia. It had become a test of international legal boundaries and domestic prosecutorial authority. As the Alabama prosecution moved toward trial, the defense filed a flurry of motions aimed at challenging the legitimacy of the case. Central to their argument was the principle of double jeopardy, protection from being tried twice for the same offense. While U.S. law allows for separate sovereigns, such as states and foreign countries, to prosecute independently, Gabe Watson's legal team argued that the manslaughter conviction in Australia should preclude any further charges in the United States. The defense also targeted the substance of the capital charges. They contested the claim that Gabe had lured Tina to Australia under false pretenses, calling it a stretch to classify a honeymoon as a kidnapping. Furthermore, they challenged the notion of financial motive. The insurance policies in question, they argued, had not been fully executed, and no payout had been received. Prosecutors faced the burden of proving intent to kill for gain, without clear financial benefit. Pre-trial hearings in early 2012 were intense. Defense attorneys argued that much of the prosecution's evidence, dive data, expert opinions, witness statements, had already been used in Australia and subjected to legal scrutiny. Introducing them again, they contended, was both repetitive and prejudicial. Alabama prosecutors sought to distinguish their case from the Australian proceedings. They claimed to have new evidence and a broader legal framework that allowed for charges based on intent, not just negligence. They highlighted Gabe's behavior leading up to the dive, including his control over the trip's planning, Tina's reported fears, and the way he distanced himself emotionally and logistically in the aftermath. The presiding judge faced a complex legal landscape. On the one hand, the prosecution was determined to pursue a charge that carried the possibility of life without parole. On the other, there was no direct evidence of Gabe physically harming Tina, no recorded threats, and no financial transaction that conclusively tied him to premeditated intent. In February 2012, just days before jury selection was to begin, the judge ruled that the prosecution had failed to present sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The motion to dismiss was granted. The court concluded that the state's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, much of which had already been litigated abroad, and did not meet the threshold for capital murder. The charges against Gabe Watson were formally dropped. He was released, having served time in Australia and avoided further incarceration in the U.S. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Tina's family expressed disappointment, reiterating their belief that justice had not been fully served. Legal experts viewed the case as a cautionary tale of jurisdictional overreach and the limits of prosecutorial power in cross-border incidents. With the legal proceedings concluded, the courtroom battle came to an end. Yet, public questions and opinions remained unresolved, and the memory of a young woman lost on a honeymoon continued to stir emotions long after the legal doors had closed. A young bride lost during a honeymoon dive, her husband's controversial behavior, and conflicting legal outcomes across two countries created a narrative that captured attention worldwide. Australian media first broke the story, covering the dive incident in detail. Early reports focused on the tragedy, but as inconsistencies in Gabe Watson's account surfaced, the tone shifted. Investigative segments, interviews with experts, and commentary from dive professionals began questioning whether the incident was truly an accident. Gabe's failure to assist in rescue attempts and his quick return to the United States were highlighted repeatedly. In the United States, coverage initially lagged but soon intensified as Tina's family gave interviews, expressing frustration with the Australian investigation and sentencing. The portrayal of Gabe Watson in American media quickly turned critical. He was depicted as emotionally detached, evasive, and controlling, qualities that contrasted sharply with public expectations of a grieving husband. The photo of Gabe walking away from his wife's grave after the funeral, hands in pockets, became symbolic of this perception. The Australian legal proceedings, especially the plea deal and the 18-month sentence, drew widespread condemnation from the public. Letters to editors, talk show segments, and online forums echoed Tina's family's sentiment that justice had not been served. The relatively short time Gabe spent in prison was seen by many as disproportionate to the gravity of the loss. When Alabama announced capital murder charges, public reaction was split. Supporters of the move believed it was a necessary step to correct what they saw as a legal failure in Australia. Others, including some legal analysts, viewed the prosecution as a political maneuver with little chance of success. The trial's dismissal in 2012 sparked another wave of opinion. Critics accused the Alabama authorities of overreaching and pursuing a weak case. Supporters of Gabe Watson saw the outcome as a vindication, a sign that due process had prevailed. Tina's family, however, remained vocal in their disappointment, expressing a deep sense of injustice that no court had held Gabe fully accountable for her death. Books and documentaries followed, each offering a different interpretation. Some focused on forensic analysis and expert opinions about dive protocols, while others centered on personal dynamics between Tina and Gabe. The case became a subject of university discussions in criminology and law, a modern example of the complexities of international justice and media influence on public perception. Despite the legal closure, the case lingered in the public consciousness. It was revisited in anniversary reports, true crime podcasts, and online forums. The unanswered questions about motive, behavior, and whether more could have been done continue to provoke debate. Tina Watson's death remained a cautionary tale. For many, it was not just about what happened underwater, but about how systems across oceans and courts struggled to define accountability in the absence of certainty. After nearly a decade of investigations, prosecutions, and media scrutiny, the legal pursuit of Gabe Watson formally ended in early 2012, when an Alabama judge dismissed the murder case for lack of evidence. The courtroom emptied quietly, and the once daily headlines faded. With no remaining charges pending in any jurisdiction, the legal system had exhausted its options. The case was dropped. The decision marked the final chapter in the legal saga, but it brought no resolution to the deep emotional scars left behind. For Tina Watson's family, especially her parents, the outcome felt hollow. Years of hope that someone would be held criminally responsible had culminated not in a trial or verdict, but in a procedural termination. They voiced frustration, believing that justice had been out of reach because of evidentiary standards and jurisdictional limits, not because of a lack of wrongdoing. In Australia, law enforcement and prosecutors stood by the outcome of their proceedings. The manslaughter plea had been based on what they could prove: gross negligence. They maintained that their investigation had been thorough, and that their sentencing reflected the legal framework available to them. Still, many within the Australian legal community acknowledged that the case had exposed limitations in prosecuting incidents involving foreign nationals and international circumstances. In the United States, the Alabama Attorney General's office defended its decision to indict, arguing that the available evidence merited the attempt. However, the inability to produce new, definitive evidence beyond what had been presented in Australia proved insurmountable. Without eyewitness accounts of direct harm, forensic confirmation of intent, or compelling financial motive, the prosecution could not meet the burden of proof required in a capital murder trial. Following the dismissal, Gabe Watson largely withdrew from public view. He resumed life in Alabama, avoiding interviews or public statements. The absence of ongoing legal action did not erase the suspicion that had followed him for years, but it did remove any legal obligation to answer further questions. The court of law had reached its limit. The court of public opinion, however, remained divided. The case gradually transitioned from active litigation to historical analysis. Legal scholars cited it in discussions of double jeopardy, international prosecution, and evidentiary thresholds in circumstantial cases. Forensic experts dissected the dive data in classrooms and conferences, debating whether Tina's death could ever have been conclusively classified. Tina Watson was remembered by friends and family not for the circumstances of her death, but for her life. Memorials were held in her honor. Her parents continued to advocate for changes in diving safety and international legal cooperation, hoping that future cases might benefit from the hard lessons learned through their daughter's tragedy. The final closure came not through conviction or acquittal, but through a legal acknowledgement that some cases, no matter how suspicious or emotionally charged, may remain unresolved when evidence falls short of legal certainty. Tina's story had been told in courtrooms, on television, and in books, but beneath all the coverage remained a young woman who died far from home, under circumstances that defied easy answers. The legal system had spoken, and its verdict was silence.